Okay, I think we are live. Hi everyone, welcome to A Little to the Left. This is a channel where we like to discuss all things to do with bringing about sexual liberation and liberation in our relationships to gender, our bodies, reproduction, and things like that. And today I'm joined by Nish. Oh, sorry, I can hear myself speak, so I'm just going to mute this. So I'm joined by Nish. He's a musician, author, teacher in areas such as Tantra, yoga, Vedanta Christian, mysticism, Platonism, and other schools of philosophy, and spirituality in general. And Nish likes to delve into some of the deepest questions in life. And so today we're going to try and tackle sacred sexuality. And I've also linked Nish's YouTube, books, Spotify in the description box if anyone wants to check them out. But yeah, I'm very excited to have this conversation. I guess we can just start off with, first of all, what is sacred sexuality? But before we get into that, I would just love to ask you, Nish, what is your background? What kind of spirituality or cosmology do you subscribe to? What tradition do you come from? Just take that in whatever direction you would prefer.
Yes, thank you, dear Kathrin. Can I open with the chant?
Yes, of course.
Om Samyak Bodha Vicharena Bhavana Masva Bhavataha Labdha Bodhodayanandam Vande Sangsthanam Atmanaha Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om, salutations to awareness, which is full of joy. By properly entering into awareness, one recognizes that all things are indeed awareness through and through. And as such, one attains to the naturally arising joy that is inherent in awareness. That is the joy whom I worship. And to that joy, I offer all of this. Om, peace, peace, peace.
That was beautiful. Thank you.
Sacred. It's an opening of a very ancient and powerful tantric manual on radically turning every single moment of life into divine spiritual rapture. The idea there is that every flavor, in fact, every thought, every emotion, every sort of mundane experience is an occasion for coming face to face with that which is sacred, the divine. It's like having a direct, immediate experience of one's own essential nature as pure awareness, and at the same time, in that same breath, having the exact experience of the divine in her resplendent form as the goddess. So this text is the Swabhododhaya Manjari, which means in Sanskrit the efflorescence of the naturally arising joy of awareness. That tells you a little bit about my background and my lineage. We are, of course, non-dualist. This whole journey for me began probably, most of our journeys don't actually start with this life. As you know, in the Indic traditions, we believe that we're just kind of continuing or carrying on a stream of events that were set into motion long, 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 long ago, right? So in this life, excitingly, I was born to yogis, and my grandfather was a great saint, a great Shaiva saint in the school of Shaiva Siddhanta, which is a South Indian school of Shaivism, Tantric Shaivism. And he was the ultimate paragon of what sainthood looked like within this tradition. He was so intoxicated all the time with God consciousness. He spent his whole day singing songs to the divine, meditating, all of that. So I learned most of what I know from him in the beginning. He passed on to me these texts and these teachings. Then some independent study, etc. After a while, I came to United States. And then in the United States, my grandfather, when he passed away, that's when I came to the lineage that I'm currently now a part of, which is the lineage of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. So I took initiation into this lineage. And so my current guru, Swami Sarvadevanandaji, is in this stream, this lineage of Sri Ramakrishna, who I believe to be the tantric master par excellence, who embodies so much of what I learned with my grandfather in the Shaiva Siddhanta lineage. So I'm a tantrika by practice, tantrika by philosophy. I'm a non-dualist in that my essential tradition, my essential position in this tradition would be that only one thing exists, and that is pure consciousness. Pure consciousness is synonymous with God in the highest sense of that word. Everybody and everything is a manifestation of pure consciousness. So the encounter with literally anything and any person is the encounter with God. So God is both transcendent, that is beyond space, time, and causality, and yet wholly immanent in all three as the substance and substratum of it all. So that's kind of in brief where I'm at traditionally.
Okay, wow. Yeah, that sounds really fascinating in your background with your grandfather. What an incredible being that must have been to have in your family and to learn from. And I am at a point where I'm definitely very new to spirituality, and I'm definitely very much learning. And I'm much more just at a point where I'm very curious to expand my my knowledge and my experience. And I'm really trying to get more into living more in alignment with some of the things that you're discussing. So I'm very much just going to be learning from you in this stream, I think. But I would love to know as well, what would the core, if you could summarize just what the core aim of your spiritual tradition is in general, that would also be really helpful.
Yeah. No, we learn from each other, Kathrin. I wish everybody could have this attitude. I find like that the more advanced a person is spiritually, the more they feel like a beginner. The newer they
Mm.
feel. Like there's this kind of bright-eyed wonderment that you feel like, oh my God, I know nothing. Like that is a sign of great spiritual maturity. This sense of there's so much to learn, and I'm excited to
Yeah.
learn it all. I'll never get to the bottom of all of this. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I love that. I love also just feeling like you can learn from even how much knowledge and wisdom are in children or in plants, or just some of the just all experiences or all beings that you come across in ways that you sometimes the people that you learn the most from are the people that you might initially have not thought would ever be at all your teachers. So yeah.
and this is the central claim of non-duality, is that only one thing exists. It's God. And everybody and
Hmm.
everything is wholly God through and through. And therefore, everybody and everything will at any given point be giving you a teaching. And so you can learn
Hmm.
from literally everything, a leaf blowing in the wind, or a children's movie, or a mean person on the highway. Like everybody is just God speaking to you.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, so what would be the goal? This is a really deep and beautiful question. What would be the goal? You could say for most Indian spirituality, and arguably I would say for all spirituality across the board in every tradition, the goal is some sort of liberation or freedom. In India, it's called moksha or mukti. The term mukti or moksha literally means liberation, freedom. It means transcendence in some cases, right? In Christianity, the word would be salvation.
Hmm.
In Islam, you get this idea of returning to primal innocence, which you also get in Christianity when the Christ says, lest ye be as little children, yours is not the kingdom of heaven. So he seems to be saying, like, liberation, what it means to be a spiritual master is to be very childlike, not necessarily childish, like a victim to one's emotions, but childlike in the sense that open, spacious innocence is childlike. So the Christ,
Hmm.
for instance, I mean, look at this man. He would just wander about. He was friends with everybody. He had unconditional love for everyone, total non-judgment, right? Friend of the
Yeah.
poor, the weak, the lowly. And his joy was just to squat by like small flowers and weep. And he would say, look at this lily. Even King Solomon was not clad in raiment finer than this. He was able to see the transcendence and the beauty in the simplest of things, in flowers. And it
Hmm.
wasn't just moment to moment rapture. He was always intoxicated with this divine bliss, always singing, always praying, always offering himself up in sacrifice to all beings. That's the Christ. Now, if you look at the Buddha, you get the exact same situation. A person who would hold a flower and cry. A person who would spend
Hmm.
all day deeply absorbed in meditation, a person whose whole life was dedicated to everyone else, and not just people but also animals. He saw divinity in all sentience. And you saw the first veterinary institutes spring up in India after the advent of the Buddha. There's a great compassion for all living beings. You could say whatever
Hmm.
the goal is, one thing is we've been very fortunate in that we in our life have seen people, or at least heard of them, who have attained that goal. And what it looks
Hmm.
like is complete bliss, complete peace, absolute unconditional love for everyone and everything, total surrender, and what looks like intoxication, a tremendous bliss. Their whole being is permeated with bliss, a joy that
Yeah.
doesn't seem to come from worldly experiences, a kind of joy that you don't often see in the eyes of the pleasured or wealthy or powerful, a type of joy that,
Hmm.
dare I say, transcends ordinary mundane experience. So most religious traditions, I think, and India is no exception, in all of its diverse traditions, hold this to be the loftiest goal, transcendence. But in this tradition, there's one nuance that's added to this. Transcendence is only really valuable if that same transcendence can be experienced in the imminent. In other words, I can't only be free once I'm dead. What kind of freedom would it be that is contingent upon me leaving the body? So it can't be an after death sort of liberation, which is true in some traditions, right? You do what you need
Yeah.
to do in this life, you pray, you do your duties, and then after you die, you go to some realm like heaven. And that idea is there in ancient India too. Lokas, various heavenly realms in which I can enjoy myself. Well, that can't be the goal, because that doesn't sound like the
Mhm.
highest freedom, a freedom that's contingent upon death. Nor could it be something that's only experienced in deep meditation, because then again, it's not really freedom, because that freedom would be confined to only in meditation. So the goal in this tradition then is to experience transcendence here and now while embodied, whether in meditation or not in meditation, whether I'm eating a sandwich, right? Or
Mhm.
whether I'm walking in the park, or whether I'm engaged in spiritual discourse, or whether I'm meditating, or whether I'm praying. In each and every one of these moments, I should feel that same transcendence wholly embodied as this experience. So that's the goal, to be both transcendent and immanent, to manifest that divinity in each and every movement of mundane life.
Mhm. Yeah, that's really beautiful. And in that sense, then the meditation is just all of life is a meditation, as opposed to just relegated to 10 minutes in the morning or something like that.
Exactly
Yeah.
right. Yeah, you nailed it. All of life. There's a beautiful poem. Tava chaka chanana sutirambike sakala shabada mayi kilate tanu. It goes on. But the sentiment of the poem is like this. And Shankara also, in one of his poems, has this sentiment, which is, um, Mother, he's praying to God, Mother, where can I walk that is not a circumambulation of your temple? Where can I lie down that is not a prostration at your feet? How can I move my hands without inadvertently doing so many mudras in the unceasing worship of you? What can I say which is not a hymn praising you? Right? So, what
Yeah.
can I do really in life except worship, except meditate?
I think that's beautiful. I really enjoy as well that you draw on, and when you speak, different traditions as well. And I really appreciate that about a lot of your videos, that you sort of, correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember you mentioning something about how it's not that you're in your tradition you believe that someone who is a Christian is wrong, or someone who is a Buddhist is wrong. It's just that there are different ways of experiencing the same thing. And I think you talked about, used the metaphor of a pond or something, that when you for some people drinking from the pond it would be water, or some, maybe you can use that, because I can't remember exactly how you put it, but just
Yeah.
the idea that we can learn from different traditions, and there are different ways of getting to the same goal, and there isn't necessarily a hierarchy between different traditions. It's just different things for different people and different parts. We're all in different journeys, I guess.
Yes, yes, you nailed it. I mean, this idea is probably the most important idea to me, that all religions in the world are all valid expressions of one truth, and they are all, most of them, equally valid means of arriving at that truth and enjoying that truth and expressing that truth itself being
Yeah.
infinite. So here's the ironic thing is that if you are theistic, meaning you accept the existence of an infinite God, you cannot in that same breath say my religion is the only way to experience and reach that God, because that would be clear limits on the limitless. So if truth is
Yeah.
indeed limitless, then it must be expressed and reached by limitless numbers of ways, right? Like infinite numbers of ways. So the first person to really articulate that idea, especially with the metaphor of the lake, is this Sri Ramakrishna. You can't quite see him, but this is my guru's guru. So this is the lineage in which I belong, Sri Ramakrishna. And the very interesting thing about this man, he was a 19th century sage who lived in kind of outside of Kolkata in a temple called Dakshineshwar. This is northeastern India. So many people regarded him to be a madman, but he was madly intoxicated in God. So the thing about him is he doesn't belong to just one tradition. You know, he was so hungry for spirituality that after he mastered all the major traditions of Hinduism, he went and practiced Islam. He literally gave up all of his Hindu tendencies. He stopped visiting the temples. He got rid of all of the pictures of his Hindu deities and gave himself wholly to Islam. And he practiced Sufism, right? And after a while, he attained the goal of that tradition. And he was able to say it not through like tolerance or some kind of, faux liberal philosophy that includes, but through direct experience, he was able to say, oh, this works. I practiced Hinduism, it all works. I practiced Islam, it works. Then he wanted to practice Christianity. So he gave up all his Islam, he gave up all his Hinduism, and he started just practicing Christianity. And he had a vision of the Christ, and he had the rapture of called the Beatitude, and he through experience again verified that that worked. So his life
Mhm.
is a veritable testament to the fact that all religions are true and they all work. So he famously gave this example, which I often cite, of the lake. So in India at the time, there were many different groups living, and predominantly there were the Hindus, there were the Muslims, and there were the Englishmen, because English people, because at that time India was, under foreign rule. So imagine
Mhm.
three people: an Englishman, a Muslim man, a Hindu woman, all coming to the lake. And now it's the same water, but each of them has a different word for it. The Englishman says water. The Muslim man might say jal or something, and then the Hindu might say pani. So the Hindu's pani, the Muslim's jal, and the Englishman's water are one and the same substance coming to you by different names. So the Jesus of Christianity, the Buddha of Buddhism, the Krishna of Hinduism, these are just like that. Pal, jal, pani, jal, water, different names for one reality.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I love that. I think it's interesting because our channel is mostly more of like focused on politics and leftism, and I think it's frustrating because at the moment there's often this idea in politics that spirituality should be kept out of politics, and
Right.
that there's also often the idea that spiritual people are apolitical, and often that politics has nothing to learn from spirituality, and spirituality has nothing to learn from politics. And I do think it can be the case that sometimes people who go down a spiritual route can then become removed from anything to do with bringing about a better world or to
Right.
do with social issues and things like that. But I mean, firstly, just from the way that you describe what the goal of your tradition or of spirituality is, already encompasses just like to have that, to be embodying that kind of freedom and joy is already to sort of, yeah, to be liberated in yourself. And
Yeah.
also people who witness that can also liberate themselves through that. But I guess I would just ask you, what would your response be to this idea that spirituality and politics are like
Mm.
how they intersect, and how can this help to bring about general political liberation or societal liberation in general?
Yeah.
And if those things, if there is a sort of contradiction there, or what you would, I guess I mean the intersections between politics and spirituality is a big topic, but yeah.
You have really good spiritual intuitions, Kathrin. I think you're right on the money here. This is such an essential question. And
Thank
it
you.
highlights, I think, some problems with transcendentalist traditions that exclude immanence. So you're right to point
Mm.
out that in the conception of liberation just offered, it is inclusive of action in all spheres of life, in the
Mhm.
social, in the political, in the cultural, as well in the spiritual, as well as in the spiritual. So this is how liberation, I would argue, feels in this tradition. One recognizes that one is not just this body. Right now, I feel like I'm this mind, this body, this person. And I feel like you, Catherine, are a different person. And there are other people in the world. There are all these inanimate objects. Some of them I want to acquire, like that. This is the experience of
Yeah.
most people. I live in a world with other people and other things, and I am an other to all of that, right? So that's the basic alienated, isolated experience of non-enlightenment. So we feel this
Mhm.
angst, this sense of being cut off. And we seek union, intimacy, connection through all the things. Now, liberation, the feeling of liberation is this realization that, oh my God, I was never just this body or this mind. What I am at the core of my being is spirit, which means pure awareness. That's why in the opening mantra I prayed to awareness, which is beyond mind, actually, which is another very deep topic. But this awareness, which is beyond body and mind, it's transpersonal. And once my sense of I shifts to that awareness, I no longer see myself as just this body, this mind, this person. Rather, I see myself as transpersonal awareness. Now I have to ask the question, what's the relationship between transpersonal awareness and all of its contents, meaning all these people and all of these things? And in this tradition, you
Mhm.
get what is called an embodied transcendental realization, which is in Sanskrit, Vishwamayam Atma Tattvam Iti Kaula. This is realization that the self pervades all things, that everything is saturated with awareness. So suddenly, I don't feel like just this body. I feel like all bodies. I feel like all mind.
Mhm.
I feel like all of this. So if I, in my own life, got cut on my arm here, it would be a matter-of-fact thing for me to put a bandage on it. Similarly, if I feel myself literally to be this entire universe, then any community anywhere that's suffering for any reason, whether famine or lack of education or political oppression, is immediately my problem. And just like I would put a band-aid on my arm, I would act in a way to address that situation, right? But interestingly, I would act in a way that's incredibly intelligent because I'm now connected to the whole. So my action is not like a unilateral action divorced from the harmony and structure of the universe. Rather, it's an action that's guided by the powers of nature itself. It will have tremendous benefit. So arguably, the most politically active individuals in our society have been the greatest spiritual masters: Buddha, Jesus, Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda. And their message has such a deep ramification for all spheres of society. They too, in their life, didn't, run away and meditate in a cave all day. They spent all day talking to people, all day teaching, all day setting up institutions. They were actually very politically involved in that. They were organizing and collectivizing and building, Take, for instance, Shankara. When he was enlightened, he walked up and down India on foot, establishing these mutts, these places of spiritual learning in which he was training monks, and he kind of organized India's monastic community into a cohesive whole. And then Swami Vivekananda, when he had this realization, like, oh, we're all one, like every person is me, then he took that same collectivization of monks that Buddha and Shankara had organized, and then he let them loose in all sorts of social welfare programs like famine relief, medicine relief. So if you become a monk in the Ramakrishna order, you might come in thinking, okay, I'm going to spend the whole day meditating or singing songs to God or reading spiritual books. If that's what you want, you'll be sorely disappointed, because there's that, but there's also an emphasis on a lot of other things, social outreach like that. So Swamiji, interestingly, Swami Vivekananda in 1890s, when he came to America, he was such an intellect. These ideas were so profound that Americans, especially the intellectual communities, were very interested, and they used to ask him a lot of political questions. Indians back home, political leaders also, Gandhi these guys were very inspired by Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. So they would ask all these political questions. And one question I think you might be interested in, it was quite deep. The question was about widow remarriage. Because at that time, post-colonization India, or this is still during British colonization, but there was like kind of very conservative norms around widow remarriage. Because traditionally, if you had lost your husband, to get married again was very shunned very frowned upon by Indian society. So there was no structure in place to allow widows to remarry, which is very damning in a community where there's not a lot of opportunities for women to work. Right? So if you don't have a husband, you don't have a fighter. But if your husband dies and you can't get married again, then what are you going to do? Right? It's a very dire situation. So they went to Swami Vivekananda about this as a great intellect of his time. He said, what do we do about this? What are your views on widow remarriage? And stunningly, he said, why are you asking me? Go ask the widows of India what they tell you to do, you should do. And I was just like, what? And it's so reminiscent, that response, with our current discussion on pro-life and pro-choice. Obviously, female-bodied people should be making decisions on, female-bodied issues. And Swami Vivekananda was cognizant of that. Also, when he established his monastery, he was very careful to distinguish male monastic communities from female monastic communities. So the nuns, the convent of Sri Ramakrishna, it's a wholly independent organization managed exclusively by women, because he didn't want, more of the patriarchs. You can see the way that Swami Vivekananda, a great spiritual master, is sensitive to issues of patriarchal leadership. He's sensitive to like political issues. And he's the same person who said that God and truth are my only politics. All else is trash. So it's a paradox, right?
Yeah. Wow. That's really, really interesting, because it's so true. Even someone like Jesus, I think a lot of the time conservative Christians, or Christians in general, forget. But I mean, he was redistributing bread. He was standing with lepers and prostitutes, and he was talking about how the rich man can't put a needle for an eye or something. I can't remember the exact phrase.
It's harder for a camel. It would be easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for the rich man to attain to heaven.
Yeah, and then even people like Martin Luther King, and Che Guevara, they were talking about how like spirituality really fed into the changes that they made in the world. So yeah, I think that to say that their spirituality and politics are disconnected would be misguided. And I think that also we see a lot of the time when people who are political and have genuine good intentions, if they don't have infused some sort of spirituality into their ideas, a lot of the time that can lead them to become egoic or chauvinistic, or to get caught up in I guess, because in a way it can be kind of a corrupting force when you're given a lot of attention or power, or and then you end up doing things that aren't necessarily for the best. Whereas if you're deeply connected to seeing yourself as no better than any other being, and being connected to nature and other, seeing how other people are struggling and sensing that struggle as if it were your own, then you're in a totally different mindset. So
that's deep insight, Kathrin, because a lot of people with good intentions, and even in Christianity there's a phrase, the road to hell is paved in those. But there are a lot of people with good intentions who turn into the very monsters they're trying to fight against. And why? Because of anger. So if anything else, I could say this is what we learned from spiritual activism, from the political activities of the great masters. We see the greatest efficacy comes from the deepest peace and the deepest connection. So if anybody acts from anger, you will only create more of the same in the world, because like perpetuates like. So if you in your anger try to attack those who you consider to be your oppressors, you only reify them as oppressors, and you only increase the propensity of oppression in the world, right? So it's very important to recognize that what true solvency looks like must first begin with inner peace. And I would say you can't make the world a joyful place unless your inner world is full of joy, unless you yourself radiate bliss and wholeness. Until you are a fully integrated being, it's going to be very difficult to act as an integrative, harmonizing force in society. If you're at home depressed and angry and upset at the world, and then you go out and try to fix the world, you're more of the same. You're going to perpetuate the problem, So there's this beautiful idea that unless I myself have the goods, I don't have anything to offer. So if I want to bring joy into the world, I must myself be joyful, Otherwise, what will I give to anybody?
Yeah, it reminds me of what one of my friends said to me once, where he was like, is your politics coming from love for the poor or hatred of the rich?
Right.
Because we, as because he was struggling at the time, like, we want more of the former, not the latter. We don't want you to come at this from a hatred. We want you to come at this for the love for the people that you're trying to liberate, or not trying to liberate, but help bring about some form of liberation. And because I think a lot of the time then also, when you say, oh, I want to create change, or I want to destroy the current system, or whatever it might be, a lot of the time that can come from your own internalized anger or a martyr complex, or it can come from a place where you're not like I, for example, was often trying to distract from my own problems in my world, and I didn't want to face them, and I didn't want to heal myself or my traumas because that was too painful. So then I just distracted myself by pouring all my energy into external things outwardly, and like, oh, other people's problems are worse, I've got to focus on theirs. But then that just wasn't helpful to them, and it wasn't helpful to me, and I realized I had to first I think you can do both at the same time, but also just not use politics as a way to just distract from my own things going on in my life, because then it can just become a projection outwards, where you're like, all the pain you're feeling inwards can just be manifested outwards, and it's a vicious cycle.
What an enlightened point of view, Kathrin. And if we want to get a little deeper here, there is no external world, actually. This is one of the deepest insights of our tradition, because if I hold a cup up in front of my eyes, I'm not actually seeing a cup. It's very important. Most of us, when we see the world, we assume the world that we see is the world that's there. And we assume that what we feel about the world reflects accurately what's there in the world. And that's a big mistake, metaphysically, but not even just psychologically, but metaphysically. Because if I'm looking at this, I'm not actually seeing a cup. What's entering into my eyes is at best light, right? Like some kind of radiance enters into my eyes, and that gets converted, I'm told, into electrical and chemical signals, which in my brain, in my mind, appears as a cup. Now, the only reason it appears as a cup is because I have previously assigned the name or label cup to experiences of this kind in the past. So my experience of that cup is colored entirely by my subjective worldview, my previous experiences, my likes and dislikes. If I walk into the room, there are so many things I might not see because my subjective landscape doesn't filter for them. So what
Yeah,
I'm looking
yeah.
at is not actually a real world. I'm looking at any given time, I'm looking at a projection of my internal world, because it's only there in my head, you know. What I'm seeing is only a mental representation, which I don't know at all maps on one to one with what's actually there. So interestingly, and this is so beautiful, but when one practices, meaning when one devotes themselves to a consistent meditation practice, when they take refuge at the feet of a real teacher, when they start to study, and when they start to have spiritual experiences, there's an inner transformation. Suddenly all of those things
Mm-hmm.
that, you know, we want to distract ourselves from, all of these inner problems, we now have the tools to address and to solve. So once these problems are to go, once I feel harmony and peace within, you know, interestingly, actually the world around me does change. And I realized that what
Mm-hmm.
I got from the news was a very partial picture of what the actuality of the world is, you know. And that
Mm-hmm.
maybe affects a person's politics too, in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes less conceptual and more actual.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so fascinating because yeah, it's true. I mean, it reminds me of how, for example, in like the Spanish language, they don't differentiate between like a tortoise and a turtle. And so if you don't have the language for it, do you necessarily notice them as different? Or how different cultures see colors or label colors differently? So if I see red, is that the same red that another person is seeing? Or
Right.
yeah, or even ideas of time. Some people see time as linear, some people see it as cyclical, and like how does that, yeah, so it's true, there is nothing, it is filtered through our own, yeah, all the constructs that we have internalized are then like manifested into the world. And it's like that saying, the world that you, it's not, we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are, or
We
something
are,
like that.
yes, yes. We see the
Yeah.
world as we are, yes.
So yeah, it was fascinating. I feel like I could talk to you all day about sort of go into each of these things individually. But yeah, bringing it back to sacred sex, how would you define sacred sex, and why do you think sacred sex is important to discuss and to bring about?
Yeah, there are a few things to note here. One is the tremendous sex positivity of Indian culture throughout its entire cultural history. So prior to the Mughal invasion, which completed in about 13th century, both the Mughal invasion and the British colonization both brought in a kind of cultural conservatism from Christianity and
Mm-hmm.
from Islam. But before that, if we look at the like indigenous attitudes of Indians towards sex, you'll find that it's incredibly affirming and positive. So as early as the law of Manu, which are smritis that might have emerged in like 3800 BCE, dating is a big problem because like Indic historians can sometimes, you know, date it to like billions of years into the past, and Western academics can sometimes be a little bit more on the conservative side. So dating is a problem. Let's say in antiquity, maybe first or second millennium BCE, we have a series of texts that detail that there are four valid goals of a human life. So being here in this embodiment, there are four things that I ought to want and ought to have. The first of these is kama. Kama actually means pleasure in all its manifestations. So looking at things that are nice to look at, hearing things that are delightful, smelling things that are nice, tasting things that are nice. And of course, kama par excellence is like the rapture of sexuality. So kama, the
Mm-hmm.
word kama is sometimes interchangeable with like just delight and exploration in sexuality. So that's the first thing that an Indian society recognizes as valid, right? The sexual pursuit and the enjoyment of that. Secondly is artha, the attainment of wealth and power. So one should aspire to those things actually. And then thirdly is dharma. Dharma is hard to translate. It means like religion or law, but it could mean morality, like doing good in the world. So good political action or philanthropy or something, that could be modern definitions of the word dharma. Back then it meant to do your rights as prescribed by the Vedas, as given to you by your station in life, right? So doing that was also a valid goal in life. But, and we'll come back to that thing we discussed in the beginning, moksha was always seen as the highest goals. The fourth thing, even beyond kama, artha, and dharma, was moksha, liberation. So these four goals initially were seen as coming in a sequence. So first a person enjoys kama, right? They enjoy pleasures. And then they decide, okay, there are other types of pleasures like acquiring wealth and money that are a little subtler, a little more refined than sensual pleasures. So now notice it's a refinement of bliss. So in some cases, the
Mm-hmm.
person who maybe wants to make money might have to sacrifice some pleasures for the greater goal of amassing wealth or something like that. Then higher than that, an even more refined joy is dharma, which is philanthropy, the joy of giving. So better than accumulating wealth is giving it away. So interestingly
Mm-hmm.
enough, that dharma, that just action, becomes the next source of bliss. So I hope you catch the trend here, where it's like from bliss to bliss. So notice Indian society is all about moving towards the ultimate fulfillment and the ultimate consummation of a human life, which starts first as the enjoyment of sensual pleasures, progresses through the acquiring of wealth and power and prestige, and finally gets to dharma, which is the joy of like being a really good person. However, even that is limited, and there is a higher joy, the finest, most rarefied joy, the most lasting, most sustainable joy, the ultimate consummation of the human quest for joy is called moksha, right? So eventually you'd have to transcend all of these, arguably, for moksha.
Mm-hmm.
So you could say the person in society with the greatest amount of wealth and the greatest collection of pleasurable experiences and the ultimate urge to give and to help, that person will eventually come to this question: is there more to life than this?
Yeah.
So Indian society, the whole of it is directed towards that. So that means all of these practices like meditation, prayer, selfless service in an act, as a spirit, in a spirit of worship, studying sacred texts, their goal is moksha, right? So now the question becomes, to what extent does like sacred sexuality come in? Because thus far I've described sexuality not really as sacred, except sacred in the sense that it's valid and part of the human journey, but not really as part
Mm-hmm.
of spirituality, right? It's like a stepping stone. You have to go through sensual delights. You have to go through all of these things until you get to a point where you're like, no orgasm is going to be the orgasm that satisfies me forever. The greatest sex in the world comes and goes, and I'm never going to be permanently fulfilled from even the deepest intimacy. And it
Mm-hmm.
seems like Indian spirituality says try it, enjoy that, explore that, but then when you get to this conclusion, come, now we'll talk. So it's almost like
Mm-hmm.
Indian spirituality in some cases begins when all desire for pleasure, intimacy, wealth, and power, and even religion end. That's kind of
Mm-hmm.
one way to look at it. So then when you come to spirituality, then you could say most Indian spiritual traditions have no room actually for sex, except as something you have to go through before you come to spirituality. So although they're very sex positive and very like pleasure affirmative, they'll still say these things are to be outgrown, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
eventually you spend most of your time meditating, etc., etc. So I would say most Indic spiritual traditions don't have sex itself as part of its spirituality, right? Okay, so now let's come to
Mm-hmm.
Tantra. So, Tantra perhaps is one of the most abused words in both India and the United States. Because when we say
Okay.
Tantra in India, sometimes people think, oh my God, that's that black magic stuff, right? That's the stuff where you like curse your
Yeah.
enemies and like summon spirits in the cremation grounds. That's what Indians think it is, most of them, like black magic. Whereas Westerners, and you probably know this, think Tantra is like just about sex. It's just about
Yeah.
like, orgies to tabla music.
Yeah.
Because there's like Carnatic tabla music, it automatically makes all sexual activity sacred. No, it takes more than just a backing track and a few candles and incense, right? But
Yeah.
so these are two misunderstandings of Tantra. The word Tantra literally means book, a type of book, a genre of book.
Oh, okay.
So
That's
that's one of the
interesting.
things that
Yeah.
we don't typically understand about Tantra, but that just like R&B refers to a certain kind of music, Tantra refers to a certain kind of spiritual literature that might have existed in India prior to the Vedic era. It might have been there in the Mohenjo-daro Harappan civilization of 2000 or 3000 BCE. It might be non-Vedic in that it might have already existed in the tribal communities of India that are on the margins of Indian urban society. But in any case, in Indian urban society, in the cultural mainstream, we could say, scholars say, that Tantra emerged in like the early 6th century AD, if not the late 5th century AD. And it emerged as a genre of literature from within the religion called Shaivism. So typically, what the Tantra would feature is a conversation between Shiva, which is the god of yoga, renunciation, Shiva, and his wife, Parvati. And a tantra was like a cute household discussion between a husband and wife. And typically it'd be
Okay.
about deep spiritual themes like the ultimate nature of reality, the cosmological structure of the universe, and most importantly, spiritual practices designed to bring moksha, liberation. So, Tantra, you could say in Sanskrit, is a moksha shastra, meaning a science of liberation. Its goal has always been for that ultimate transcendence, that liberation. And so typically what we say when we say Tantra, we say ritual. So Tantra doesn't actually mean
Okay.
sensual pleasure. It typically just means doing long, elaborate rituals. That's what Tantra
Mm-hmm.
comes down to, right? And in the beginning, Tantra was not non-dualistic. It was dualistic in that it saw God as separate. It was, in some cases, quite patriarchal, quite exclusive to Brahmanical culture, and quite orthodox and conservative. So that's, I think, kind of radically different from how we conceive of Tantra, because we always think it's like very separate,
Yeah.
right? But
I
no, so
had no idea about the history at all.
yeah. So I think that's important to first clarify before we start getting into discussions about sacred sexuality, because necessarily these are going to be discussions about Tantra, right? So we have to start by
Mm-hmm.
saying Tantra is not what most people think it is. Tantra has been described as a loom or a weave, but this is a lazy definition. Obviously, in the Indian dictionaries, Sanskrit dictionaries like Monier Williams, you'll see loom and weave as one of the definitions of Tantra, but it's not what the culture indigenously saw the word to mean, right? They saw it to mean a type of book originally within the Shaiva tradition that detailed mostly ritual practices for the purification and the eventual liberation of the practitioner. Okay, so Tantra means
Okay.
ritual. However, something very interesting about the ritual is that Tantric ritual is very embodied. So it features incense, it features beautiful flowers offered at the feet of beautiful statues, like you can see behind me. So
Mm-hmm.
statues, incense, flowers, a lot of music and dance were used as part of the ritual, because after you invoke the presence of the divinity, one must entertain the divinity as you would a guest. So you would dance for the divinity, you would play music for the divinity. So music and dance, as we were saying, Kathrin, before the broadcast, is significant for spiritual life, because it's a big part of ritual. And of course, you can't have
Mm-hmm.
puja, tantric ritual, without mantra. So the spoken word, just like in Vedic times, becomes very important. So notice how embodied and how sensual all of this is. Smells,
Mm-hmm.
sounds, bells, invocations that require mantric resonance. You're chanting, you're dancing, you're moving, you're doing mudras, various hand gestures, during the ritual. And just to give you
Yeah.
a taste, it'd be like Om Pranaya Namaha, Om Apanaya Namaha, Om Udanaya Namaha, Om Vyanaya Namaha, Om Samanaya Namaha. What I did was extracting the essence of food offered to the deity and sending the energy and essence of that food into the deity. So notice the
Yeah.
sensuality of the hand movements combined with the. So, although Tantra began as a pretty conservative, orthodox, Brahmanical, patriarchal tradition, it featured all of these elements, right? Of like embodied,
Yeah.
flowing, kind of sensual spirituality. Okay, now this is important. About the end of the 9th century, there emerged a tradition called the Kaula. And it was, again, two householders, Machanda and his wife, Konkanamba. These two householders emerged and influenced a lot of the tantric schools at the time. And now you get what is called a more sensualist, more left hand, more embodied, and more goddess oriented Tantra. So, where Tantra in the beginning was all about Shiva, now it's more about his spiritual consort, Shakti. Okay, and then not
Mm-hmm.
only that, the realization of these left-hand masters, these Kaula masters, was such that they saw Shiva and Shakti not as two different things, not as the transcendence and immanence, but one and the same thing. So now you get the tradition to which I belong, non-dual Tantra. And now non-dual Tantra will argue this, that everything in the world is nothing other than that transcendence. Shiva is all of this. So now you get more room for things like sacred sexuality. Because now, insofar as every mundane act, it's not just that sex is sacred, everything is sacred. Therefore, sex is
Mm-hmm.
included in that broad
Mm-hmm.
category. So this, I think I will say this last, but this is what I think most people think Tantra is, and they're mistaken, that it's about sex. But it's not.
Mm-hmm.
It includes sex. Why? Because in its left hand, more kaula, more sensualist, more non-dualist, more goddess-oriented orientation, it says at its essence, everything is sacred, everything is saturated divinity, including, but not exhaustively or exclusively, sex.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, that was a lot.
Interesting. No, that's fascinating. Thank you so much for all of that. It's really interesting because it made me think about how the fact that we perceive Tantra and Western culture generally to be just about sex just speaks to how much we are such a culture that simultaneously we make everything about sex, but then simultaneously never really talk about sex in any way of like actual substance. And it's strange. And yeah, and then when you were talking about Tantra as being really embodied and including like the incense and the other forms of like connection with our bodies, it's like interesting how, in the Western imagination, anything that is embodied, it seems to be just reduced to sex itself, and as opposed to anything that is including the other aspects of our senses and connecting to to our feet, to our legs, to smell, to even the sixth sense. We tend to think of senses as only 5, but there's a sixth dimension to that, possibly even more that we're not aware of. And so it's interesting because it makes me think about how, but even when we reduce something like Tantra down to sex, we see sex as just mostly very mechanical and very much like just something that is reduced to the genitals, as opposed to something that is like more encompassing, like the spiritual aspects, or connecting to each other in different ways as well. So I guess I was wondering with Tantra, if Tantra could be, because I guess I differentiate between like set modern notions of sex, and especially in like the Western imagination, compared to like sacred sex as something like a different kind of dimension to sex that enables you to access other realms of, I don't know, cosmic orgasms or cosmic sensations, or ways to connect to this sense of divinity or oneness. And I guess I'm trying to figure out how can we get what are the differences between this like modern notion of sex versus the sacred sex, and like how can we get more people into that sacred version? Or is it, again, and now I'm thinking maybe I'm focusing again too much on the sex aspect, as opposed to thinking about first and foremost, there are other ways to get more deeply connected with ourselves and others before it even involves any sex itself.
Yes, again, Kathrin, your spiritual intuitions are spot on, and you're right on the money with, how Kaula, or you could say these more sensualist forms of Tantra, how they conceive of sacred sexuality, because it is not at all confined to the mechanical act of like lovemaking itself. It's a kind of pleasure and sensuality and embodiment that extends through all of one's sensual experiences, and also trans-sensual experiences. So like you mentioned the sixth sense, and you're right, how many other dimensions of experience are possible, and how many of them are inherent here and now? I just don't notice it because I haven't yet cultivated or refined my ability to notice it. So we'd say, in short, that the goal of this tradition is the orgasm in every breath. We have a beautiful word called svatma chamatkara, which means poetic rapture or aesthetic joy. It's the total obliteration of the self and the expansion into a wider, vaster sense of the self, while still experiencing a totally embodied and immanent sensory experience. So you could say every smell should be rapture, should be chamatkara. Every sound should be chamatkara, and every thought should be chamatkara. So the way to experience sacred sexuality in the Kaula is to experience thought not as like linguistic meaning-making moments, but rather as sensations. Some thoughts are like spiky and hard. Some thoughts are globular. So if you just sit there in meditation and you divest all your thoughts of their inherent meaning, like, oh, I'm bad for thinking this, or I'm good for thinking that, or what does that, if you just stop all of that, and if you could just be present with the raw, immediate sensation of thinking and being, that's sensual. The thoughts themselves are like just corpuscles of energy that arise and fade away. So each thought is like a wave of pleasure arising in me. Even the horrific ones, like grief, a wave of grief is experienced by the tantric master as like art. It becomes like grief in the poetic sense. It's a thing of sharp beauty, not oppressive. Pain is no longer something I suffer. It should be something that is a sharp sensation of my own enlivenment. It's a thrilling sense of my own being. So if you divest everything of its label, name, and meaning, and if you could just be with the fullness of this moment in a kind of like intimate, direct, and immediate way, everything becomes sensual. Everything becomes orgasmic, right? Including sex, but not limited to the mechanical act. So that's why a tantrika is so pleasured, you could say, because every breath is orgasm. Being itself is the bliss. And so we'd go further to say, okay, let's clarify. There is some dimension to my experience called awareness. And that awareness is the ground in which all of my experiences come and go. I am that awareness. So that awareness is called Shiva, or simply called the goddess, or called just Chit, which just means awareness, or Chitti, which is a feminine singular noun. So I like Chitti because it makes it goddess awareness. to imply that it's divine. And of course, we could have a whole other hour discussing why awareness and God are synonymous. That's a big interest of mine, is showing how you, awareness, are none other than God, right? That God is here and now as you. So this awareness, we call it the goddess, if you will. She's the ground of all experience. But also, like a wave arising from an ocean, all experience arises from her. So she creates, if you will, every single cognition that I can experience in this moment. Okay? Now, if I pay attention to the cognition, I have two choices. Either I can get lost in the cognition itself, or I can step back. Step back is not too clean a phrase. I could drop in maybe, or I could relax or repose into that spaciousness around each cognition. If I can do that with anything, whether a feeling of grief or a smell of a rose, if I can do that, I will access what is called beauty or truth or spirituality. So what makes it sacred is that I'm able to experience the spaciousness of awareness in which it vibrates, whatever it is, including the sexual act. Right? So because awareness is always present, not just in a meditation, it's always present here and now in everything. Therefore, anything is a just doorway through which I can enter into my own divinity. So what does it feel like to enter into one's own divinity? We say that awareness is full of bliss. It's innately bliss itself. It has Ananda Shakti. So that means the experience of being aware is also the experience of transcendental bliss. Right? Or peace, if you will. So yeah, that's what makes all sensations tick, that dimension of awareness.
Okay, yeah, it's really interesting because it made me think about how this goes back to our discussion about the intersections between spirituality and liberation in general, because I think that when we talk about becoming really aware of the sensations of our bodies and of sex itself, I think that our systems of oppression, white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, they want to keep us in a constant state of disconnect from that awareness, from those sensations of our bodies, because if we are alienated from our bodies and the realm of deep feeling, then we're more willing to submit to our bodies being controlled and disciplined and mastered by employees, or or when we're so disconnected from the realm of deep feeling, then we're more likely to accept conditions that oppress people and oppress us. And when we're so disconnected from ourselves, then we tend to live from external directives, or instead of this internal voice within ourselves that is often more pure, more able to tell us what is the right thing right now, what our intuitions knows to be the path that we should take. Or we live by the structures of our system, by external things like what are the family or the hierarchies or the government or whatever says is how you're supposed to live. And so to really be in tune with our bodies and to be in tune with the subtle sensations, and not be so based on the mind. As you said, I love that way of thinking of your mind as thinking about it in terms of the feeling that is coming up, as opposed to, or like the thought as a feeling, as opposed to just being so over-identified with the mind. Because then the mind, this goes back to the idea of dualisms in general, the mind-body dualism, and how the mind is connected to like the culture as opposed to the nature, and the white as opposed to black, and so on. And so in a way, the more connected we are to our minds, the less connected we are to the opposite end of the dualism. So I would be, take that in whatever direction you want, but I'd also be really interested to hear about how the mind-body dualism in general, how this idea of sacred sexuality and sacredness in general can help to dismantle the mind-body dualism and dualisms in general, I guess.
Yeah. I've done a lot of these, quite a few of these guest appearances on podcasts. I have to say, don't tell anybody else, but I'm enjoying this one the most. These are such profound questions, such insightful questions.
Thank you, that's so nice.
Yeah, such a deep conversation. And again, this is one of those things that can just go on for all eternity. Because I sense like 10 lectures worth of response here, because there's so much to unpack in your question. like Descartes' notion of the mind being different from the body, this Cartesian duality that seems to be at the heart of all of Western science and all of Western philosophy, post-Enlightenment era thinkers, right? And then in India, you have something else, which is a trichotomy. So in Indian spirituality, it's not a mind-body duality, it's rather a trichotomy between soul, mind, and body. And that dichotomy is
Oh,
also there
wow.
sometimes
Wow.
in other religious
Yeah.
traditions, like Islam, Christianity. They also have this idea that there is a soul, and that soul is either a very refined part of the mind, as in the case of some post-Enlightenment Christian thought, or rather it's just categorically different from the mind. So even in Abrahamic traditions, you'll have this trichotomy. So that's why we have to address these from 2 points of view: the mind-body duality, which is largely, going to be confined to materialist discussions, and the trichotomous view of the human personality, which is soul, mind, body, which is largely, going to be spiritual and religious in nature. So notice,
Yeah.
those in the materialist reductionist camp deny the existence of a soul because they can't experience
Yeah.
it. There's nothing that you can point to and say that's the transcendent soul. But you can point to thoughts, and you could say, oh, this is my mind. This is the realm of ideation. It's in dreams, it's in emotions. And these thoughts aren't objects. So I've got thoughts, and then I've also got a body, and that's a physical body, and often they feel at odds with one another. To be the body is to reject
Yeah.
the mind, and to be the mind is to reject. And most of us just live in the mind, and as you said, are cut off from the body. So we live in a world of
Yeah.
our ideas and our thoughts, but very seldom do we actually interface with reality as it is, as a sensation, as an embodied experience. So, and that, exactly right, Kathrin, as you pointed out, is probably the lever of control. The fact that I'm so disjointed from my experience is what makes me so, disconnected from the source of all energy. And in my despondency, I just default to accepting whatever authority exists in my time. So there is actually a
Yeah.
radical political activism in just reclaiming one's own mind and body as an immediate story-free experience in each and every moment. And this political act happens literally in each and every moment when I make the choice to be present as opposed to like be drawn off into some fantasy realm of thought, you know? So again, Catherine, this is just me glossing your question because there's so much in there, and I'm gonna see where. Okay. How about this? One very interesting thing in Indian spiritual thought, mostly from the school of Sankhya, one of the most ancient schools of Indian philosophy, is this: mind is a subtle form of matter. It's very deep. They saw matter as dichotomous in that some matter is gross and physical, not gross as in ew, but physical. And that would be like matter in our traditional sense of the word matter. Electrons, protons, what have you. Matter, stuff. And then they defined thoughts and emotions and subtle sensations also as a kind of matter. And that was called subtle matter or sukshma matter. And so both of them are seen as the material world in its gross and subtle dimensions. Interestingly, some scientists, I was hearing this from a great monk, Swami Sarvapriyanandaji, he's like, some scientists today are actually even intuiting this idea. They're positing what is called perceptrons, or the stuff of the mental universe. I think it's so cool because it echoes this idea, right? Okay, so now we have a fundamental dichotomy between me and what appears to me. So I'm over here, and before me, there is a myriad of sensations, some of them subtle and some of them gross. So I experience thoughts, I experience emotions, I experience dreams, but I also experience objects. So notice, the real dichotomy is not actually between mind and body. Both mind and body are together experiences, but I, unlike them, are the experiencer. So the real dualism here, the real dichotomy, is between me, the seer, and that, the seen. Aham and idam, or drashta and drishyam. So I am the seer, the experiencing subject, and that, including mind and body, is the seen, the experienced object. So now Indian spirituality gives us a different duality, a duality of seer, seen, experiencer, experienced, subject, and object. Do you see? Notice how this resolves the duality of mind and body. It links mind and body together as the seen, as the experienced. But unfortunately, it introduces a new transcendent duality, the duality of soul in its relation to mind and body, or God and matter, or in the language that we've been using today, transcendence and immanence. Right?
Wow.
Okay, so here is a deep insight, right? Isn't this mind-blowing?
Yeah.
The way Indian philosophy, as early as like, I don't know, 500 BCE has already solved riddles that appear in Western thought, in the Enlightenment era. Mind-blowing. Anyway, so this understanding alone contains within it the seeds of liberation. Because if I really understand this dichotomy, if I understand that I am always the seer and never the seen, that realization is the same as saying, I am not the mind, I am not the body. My mind and my body, like every mind and every body, are just so many objects that come and go. In me, the awareness that is aware of it all. So it's kind of like if I had a light shining on a series of objects. Some of those objects are small, subtle. Others are big, gross. Notice the light is not affected by anything that happens on the level of the objects upon which it shines. So, for instance, if I spill wine on the carpet, I might have to clean the carpet, but I never have to clean the light because light is transcendent to the carpet. Right? So similarly, I awareness shine or illumine upon all of my experiences while remaining transcendent. So if you break my body, that's like breaking a cup. What's it to me? The light. If there's grief in my mind, that's like a stain on the carpet. What's it to me? The light. I just sit here in my freedom, illumine it all. And I watch as it all comes and goes in a state of quiescent peace. That's one type of liberation, the liberation of Sankhya, the liberation of yoga, you could say. So how do we resolve this dichotomy then? Because now we have a new dichotomy, the dichotomy of seer and seen. And this resolves the trichotomy too, because mind and body are just now the seen. And this trichotomous third, which is the soul, is the same as this awareness. So now notice the Westerner says, or the Western materialist says, where's the soul? Where's the soul? I can't see the soul. And we say, you know why you can't see it, brother? You can't see it because it is the seer. The only thing your eyes can't see right now are themselves, except in the screen or except in a mirror. The eyes, the eyeballs can never see themselves in real time because they're the instrument through which physical seeing happens. Similarly, you can never hold a soul or grasp the soul or point to the soul because it is the means through which all grasping, holding, and pointing occur. Right? So this is a mind-blowing idea too, because then if you say, I have a soul, you're wrong. You are a soul. You don't have a soul. It's not an object. You are the soul.
Wow. Yeah, this is mind-blowing to me because I'd never ever heard of this idea of the soul as being separate from the mind, like as a third dichotomy in the dualism. I'd only ever thought of it in terms of, like the mind-body, black-white, male, female, etc., etc. But yeah, so essentially this idea of the seen is that you are above your mind, you're viewing from above your mind, you're viewing from above your body, like in meditation, or I guess meditation is often just the absence of thought, but it's still you're kind of aware of what is going on in your mind, what is going on in your body. And so with that, then would this idea of the soul also be true for other forms of dualisms as well, that it's not, for example, male and female? It would be the soul is watching the male and female, or man and woman, or black and white. Would that also apply? I guess so, because you can have that awareness, you can have that scene of all things, right? So I wonder how
right now I'm aware of what I call a male body, right? I'm aware of it, but I am not it, so therefore I'm not male. I could just be just as readily be aware of a female body, right? And I again would not be it. So you're right to point out the agender of the soul. It's beyond both male and female, being as it is beyond all dualities, but subject to this higher duality of seer and seen. So I think you're coming on to something cool too, which is how do we gender all of this? Like, what would this mean in terms of gender? Because you know what? The Sanskrit word is gendered. The Sanskrit word for soul is gendered masculine, purusha. So, you could say that everyone is cosmically, divinely a man. Because the word Purusha means the eternal man. The word Purusha just means dude. It literally in Sanskrit means man. It's like person, but male gendered. So you are Purusha. So you and I, however we choose to identify in terms of gender or sex, you and I are both Purusha, both dudes. However, I, as a mind, Nishant, who is an ego, which is connected to mind and body, he is fully a woman, because the word for seen is Prakriti, and Prakriti is female gendered pronoun. So that means everyone as a mind and body is a girl. They have to be, because the divine feminine is all of this, being creative as she is. So the ancient Indian thought didn't actually see this in terms of gender neutrality, although philosophically, yes, it would amount, as you rightly pointed out, Kathrin, to being beyond all notions of sex in the body or gender in the mind, or as a cultural construct, all of those being objects of me, the unnameable, undefinable, unlabelable awareness, right? So this is very important. Why did the ancient Indians see it in terms of Purusha and Prakriti? Why did they give genders to this? And you find this play of gender repeated a lot in the Vaishnava tradition. All men in the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition are encouraged to see themselves as women, Why? Because they're encouraged to see God as the only man. Krishna is Purusha, the only man, and everyone is a woman. They're gopis, gopikas. They're cowherd girls in the forest who are amorously attracted to Krishna. So even men are invited to have this attitude, which is very interesting, right? Then you get issues of gender like with Vishnu and Shiva. Vishnu assumes a female form, Mohini, and Shiva and Vishnu in his Mohini form, make love and have this child. So you get this kind of like homoerotic idea where gods can change gender. So gods are incredibly gender fluid, like in the case of Vishnu Mohini. And then in the Shaiva tradition, you get so much emphasis on mother and father, Shiva being the father and Shakti being the mother, and them coming together in union. So I would say all of that can be traced back to this basic gender duality between Purusha, the eternal man, which we all are as awareness, and Prakriti, the eternal woman, which we all are as bodies, minds, people. Oh, and I have to say, so this is so nice. There was a saint one time who used to wander about naked, but she was a woman, right? And so she would come into contact, and a lot of saints wander about naked. It's kind of common in India. Just like they're called Nangta or naked ones, naked ascetics. They're so free, they're free of even clothes. The original, the OG nudist. They'll be wandering about. And then there was a famous female one, Mahadevyaka. So she would wander about. And sometimes the male ascetics would feel kind of upset about that. They'll say, this is not appropriate. It's not appropriate for you as a woman to be standing before Brahmin males without a garb. Like, have some shame, woman, they'd say. And her response to them was, why should I be ashamed? She looked around and said, I see no men here. And you could say that was a deep philosophical statement. I see bodies. Bodies are mother. I see minds are mother. All of us are women. Right? So there's some gender stuff going on too, I think you could say.
It's really interesting because in general, I think that at the moment, I've been thinking a lot about the idea of abolishing gender altogether, in the sense that it's oppressive, or it can be oppressive, to label beings that come onto this earth as male or as you're a man, you're a woman, and then assigning people certain roles based on those genders. And I think it's interesting to try and how I'm trying to figure out for myself how to reconcile wanting to abolish the idea of gender as this oppressive thing, so that then people can instead be free to adopt whatever way of being they would like without being oppressed by these roles that you're having to conform to, while simultaneously thinking about the divine masculine or the divine feminine, and thinking about how the idea of those archetypes can still be useful, or if using those ideas of divine feminine or masculine is still somehow buying into the idea of gender roles, which then is oppressive. So trying to reconcile these things, I think, is interesting and difficult. Notice
how there are the seeds of a reconciliation. Like there are three separate ways to reconcile that offered by the aforementioned discussion, right? So there are three ways to do it. Like, either you say, if we say we're minds, bodies, egos, like if we say we are people, you could say, okay, from this basic duality of Purusha and Prakriti, we are all women, which frees everyone up to define what being a woman means. We're all women. That's what, because notice now the dichotomy is gone. There's no man anymore. If we are minds, bodies, egos, then there's a non-duality of divine feminine. We're all women. And because we're all women, it rubbishes all notions of what a woman should be or look, how she should like, etc. So I should just step into that and say, this is as much feminine as anything else is going to, because energy is all feminine, right? Or the second way to reconcile this is to say, you know what? I'm Purusha. I'm pure spirit. And therefore, we're all pure spirit. We're all men. And that rubbishes the idea of what a man should be. If we're all men, then there's, notice that. So either you can resolve the duality by saying all women or all man, which amounts to abolishing gender, or you can do the third route, which is to go beyond both man and woman and say, I, Purusha, am neither man nor woman. I am the witness of both dualities, man and woman, and therefore I stand apart, transcendent to them all. But notice, this third route requires that we go even beyond Purusha and Prakriti. So that's why in non-duality, you do get what I think would be an ultimate, because your insight about gender, I think, is very good because it's tied to duality. The fundamental, you can't get rid of the fundamental experience of duality. Insofar as I feel duality between mind and body, gender of man and women will always exist. And fighting against the dichotomizing of that is really not it's missing the point, because actually what you're resisting is duality itself, right? Not just man and woman, but any kind of duality, day and night, mind and body. So that's why non-duality is the spiritual effort to reconcile all dualities, including but not exclusive to gender dualities.
Interesting. Sorry, I keep saying interesting, but I do just find it really interesting. I also love that during this conversation, I had initially made a lot of notes before this to talk about, but I've just been really enjoying getting rid of the control or the mind focus, and instead focusing on like being in this moment and just seeing what comes up, as opposed to trying to like, I'm really, really enjoying that aspect of it. I was going to say something and now I've forgotten what I was going to mention. But it will come back to me in a moment. But I guess we can move on to the other aspect that I wanted to discuss, which was talking about how these ideas of like sacred sexuality and infusing life with sacredness in general can bring us like how we can add sacred sexuality and eroticism and this like embodiment and things like that to every aspect of our lives, and not just relegated to the bedroom, I guess. And I was really inspired by certain thinkers who talk about liberation through eroticizing different aspects of life. I remember in Teaching to Transgress, Bell Hooks talked about this idea of, even in the classroom, even as a teacher, she would like to bring the erotic and bring passion back into life, as opposed to back into the classroom, where before there'd been like the mind-body dualism, and everyone was like, no, you can't be passionate, you can't bring the body into this, it just has to be about like the text and that's it. And so she started to really see that there could be eroticism even with her students and things like that, and the more that she brought that into it, the more that would make teaching so much more effective. And then Audre Lorde, she wrote this text called The Uses of the Erotic as Power. And she makes this really interesting point about how if we can really tap into this sense of sacred sexuality and eroticism and experience what it's like to have so much joy, the knowledge of that joy, the awareness of that joy we know ourselves to be capable of, can then inspire us to no longer accept that or other aspects of our lives are not going to include that joy we know ourselves to be capable of. So then, whether it's our relationships or how we are in our day-to-day lives, we will no longer accept that we won't live with this incredible erotic power, spirituality and joy that we know ourselves to be capable of. And again and again, I just noticed so many people who mentioned similar ideas of infusing all aspects of life with this level of eroticism. But I guess it's also it's difficult to distinguish between what is meant by eroticism as opposed to awareness, because I guess we're talking about both as kind of being the same thing. So I guess these words end up being taking us away from what is actually the root of, I guess there's many different ways of describing the same thing, as we said at the beginning. So whether you call it erotic, whether you call it meditation, whether you call it awareness, whether you call it presence, I don't know, it's all but
Oh, profound. Oh my God. I enjoyed that so much. Bell Hooks' point about bringing the erotic into the classroom. You're right. Let's maybe refine the use of the word erotic and be very clear as to what it means. Is it the same as just being aware? Abhinavagupta, one of the greatest tantric masters of all time, he's famous not only for his spiritual works in Sanskrit language, but many Sanskrit scholars actually also maybe only know him for his poetic and aesthetic works. So he was a great commentator on art, particularly poetry, but also drama and music. He was very interested in what makes art art. And his art theory, his aesthetic philosophies were almost entirely affected by his spiritual realization, informed by his spiritual writing. So all of these conversations that we're having about awareness, he then, in trying to figure out what the art experience was, comes to this conclusion. So in Indian art, there are 8 rasas. Rasa means literally juice, but it also means flavor or taste or experience. There are 8 rasas. There's like hasya, the comical, vira, the ennobling, bibhatsa, the disgusting, all of these. And one of them is shringara or rati, the erotic. So what makes the erotic erotic? And Abhinavagupta, after he looks at 8 of these flavors, he adds a 9th. The 9th is called Shantarasa. Shantarasa is basically what we've been discussing so far, resting or reposing in the spaciousness of pure awareness as the ground of all experience. So he argues, if I just sad, if I was feeling sad, that wouldn't necessarily be art. That would just be me having an experience of sadness. However, if I go into a movie or watch a drama in which sorrow is being depicted, I might now come to have that same emotion. But because there's a level of detachment, or rather a level of spacious intimacy, where I know that sadness is vibrating within the space of the drama, that spaciousness converts what would otherwise just be pedestrian sadness into a refined art experience, sorrow, or like compassion, karuna, or something like that. So he's saying lust, the experience of desiring sensual gratification and seeing perhaps others as a means to like sensually gratifying myself, or lust, the desire to acquire any object of gratification, that experience in me becomes exalted. It becomes in some ways refined, and it enters into the realm of the erotic insofar as I can just spaciously be with it. If I can experience it without needing to be moved into any action whatsoever. If it forces me to go out and like try to get someone's number or something, then it's back to lust. Or if it causes me to like think about it and reify it, but if instead I'm able to just be there and experience the vibration of that feeling in me within the spacious, never losing touch of awareness, it becomes the erotic. So notice what Abhinavagupta has done is he's used the theories on awareness to inform the meaning of the word the erotic. So in the classroom, for instance, if one is re-encountering passion, re-encountering the erotic, it's very powerful, very liberating, because it's another way that awareness represents itself to itself and becomes nourished by itself. So that being the case, then you're right to point out every experience is erotic, insofar as every experience has awareness as its foundation. So the technique that we have is it's as simple as this: to just as we inhale, follow the breath down into the base of the heart, and then land there. Move from the mind down into the heart. And this could be a moment of closing one's eyes. It could be a feeling of going inward like a tortoise withdrawing its limbs, back into the center. Or you could maybe feel into your central column called the Shushumna Nadi, which is, in the center of the brain. Like if you feel the place where the upper palate of the mouth connects with the back of the throat. Just behind and above that point is the center of the brain. And you can imagine that with each inhale, like taking an elevator, you are going down from the center of the brain into the base of the heart. Or you could suddenly become aware of your feet, or the perineum, the point between anus and genitals, which is the base of the Shushumna Nadi. Just like that, by bringing your attention to the central line at any point or chakra along it, just by becoming aware of the feet, just by entering into a kind of spacious, immediate, story-free experience of this moment, everything becomes not just eroticized, but spiritualized, right?
Yeah. And I think that, I guess it's interesting to think about how just by bringing us back to our body, or even that moment of like breathing into the different areas of my body, it can really help to heal so many traumas, especially sexual traumas that can arise, because a big aspect of any kind of traumas that we have is to really disassociate from the body, especially if it's to do with like physical or sexual violence. And I definitely found that I had this experience once where I was doing a meditation and I was listening to a Hare Krishna song whilst I was meditating, and I suddenly had this experience of feeling this thing which I would now call like the divine feminine. And even though at the time this was a few years ago, so I didn't have much knowledge or experience of spirituality, but I remember just feeling this presence, but in different areas of my body, which I think are now the chakras. But yeah, it was like one here and then one below and in different areas. And it was almost like at the time, because I was really trying to process a lot of sexual violence, and it was really like this healing essence that was just coming to different areas of my body. But it was through the meditation, I guess, I felt like this disconnect that I had, where I was often operating from above my body, or just not really in my body, seeing myself from above. It was like that reconnection was happening, and it was a really beautiful experience. And I think that when it comes to healing from traumas, I think a lot of the time the traditional therapy model is again very mind-centered, where you go to talk to a therapist and then you might process and you talk, and they do emphasize things like breathing and body practices a lot sometimes, but in general it's very much let's process via verbally speaking. And I've definitely found that there's something about healing from sexual traumas related to like more deep embodiment and more of like a spiritual, I guess, ways of being, even going for a run or something, where like the tension that is kept and the pain that is still inside your cells or whatever, just like it goes out of your body through the energy releasing. And that's what they say, right? If the emotions, they're trapped inside of you, and until you grieve or until you release them by anger, whatever it might be, they're still there. And so I think it can be really powerful to use these tools of spirituality. Well, maybe seeing it as a tool is not necessarily the best way to see it, but because it's I don't know, I guess it's fine to say it's a tool, but things like that can be really helpful. And I wish there was more of an emphasis within therapy or within healing that moved away from just a very like mind-centered, speaking-centered way of being, because I think that's just a natural outgrowth of the very Western philosophical tradition of how to solve problems. And I know that in many indigenous groups, there's often much more emphasis on maybe you're like circles of groups of people together, like this non-hierarchical thing of Noah and known, or the therapist or psychologist as the person with all the power and the knowledge, and you as this, which can be very infantilizing, or very much like you're not having power in that moment. Whereas when you're equally, I've had with groups of people before, when we were grieving about the environment, we used to come together in a circle, and we used to on a very equal level just like grieve with each other about our experiences of nature and the earth and the dying of the planet. And I think there was something even more powerful about that kind of environment coming together, as opposed to the hierarchy of a psychologist. And it reminds me of that Paulo Freire Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I don't know if you've read that, but it's like he talks about the teacher-student dynamic and how disempowering it is for students, and how liberatory it could be to have more non-hierarchical structures when it comes to teaching in general. But yeah, sorry, that was a bit of a went in lots of different directions. But
no, my favorite thing is when Kathrin goes in lots of different directions, because it's so rich, so much depth there, especially like identifying, that maybe it's the mind-body duality which is at the heart of this schism between our current modes of therapy and the ones that maybe could be more helpful. Like, for instance, if you just say all discomfort is of a psychological sort, and therefore I must only solve it on the level of the mind through talking, through thinking, it cuts us off from maybe where the problem really is. Or if we say all physical ailments are only confined to the body, and therefore you do medical treatments that only address the body without any. So notice that both forms of treatment are lacking in that they don't include the other. So therefore, I always highly recommend hatha yoga. Just a simple hatha yoga practice. There's something about it, because as you move into these postures, these asanas, there's something about breathing and being in a particular posture that opens up space in the body that can help you tap into dormant emotions and allow the energy of that emotion to flow freely. It's like, unless that energy can flow, it's always going to be stuck, as you said. And it's really, the book, The Body Keeps the Score, was very important because it showed people that emotions are in musculature, right? And many a times in my postural yoga classes, I'll be doing a pose, or someone will be doing a pose, and then emotion will come up, and people in a stretch will suddenly start to cry, feeling something they've never felt in a really long time. And at the end of that, there's a processing that happens that's totally non-cognitive. They don't need to make meaning out of it. They don't need to ask, what did my mother say that causes me to feel this? No, they just feel it, and it flows, and they're free. So I think you're right to point out a very powerful form of dealing with trauma, which all of us have, for so many reasons that we don't even know about.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say I had an experience once where I was taking some plant medicine, and I started to experience this sensation of where my body was no longer my body. My body became my grandma's body, and my great-grandma's body, and my great-great-grandmother's body. And it was a really beautiful sensation of the ways in which our bodies and our ancestors are within ourselves. We are not just ourselves. We are, all the previous iterations of beings before us. And again, so we're not just connected to everything in this non-dualistic way in the here and now. It's also for all that came before and all that will come into the future. And I think that's really powerful as well, because I think that gives you more responsibility for how you're going to treat this planet, or how you're going to treat people in general. If you know that everything is going to continue on, that you are going to continue on in other forms in the future, right. Not like physically necessarily, but at least it doesn't end here. And I think that goes back to this idea of even death and life and death as this dualism, which isn't necessarily true. It's like when we die, we're not really truly ever dead. We're still continuing on in other forms. And whatever spiritual tradition you may believe in, that might look differently, but still this like I think it's a very dangerous, again, Western philosophical idea that like this death that is it, it's finished, because I think that gives us the response, that makes us think that everything is just about my life here and now. How can I make it as full of pleasure and as full of I don't know, just selfish desires as now? Because if you don't think that anything continues, then you probably don't have that much ideas of thinking beyond yourself as what's going to happen in the future. So, but even the idea of a future is a construct. Yeah.
So that's a profound insight, that the now is not an exclusive moment that denies past and future. Rather, the now includes an infinite past and an infinite future. That's a profound insight. Right now is all the births that I've ever lived, ever, which is literally anybody's ever come before this moment. And right now is everyone who will ever come after this moment. It's all me contained in awareness. Profound thought. And this experience of being all bodies, both before, now, and after, this is true non-duality. The idea there's no temporality. It's an atemporal, aspatial experience of total privation. We could succinctly define it. You're not this person, you're all people, not just in this current slice of time, but always. And always that will be the case. So the feeling rubbishes notions of teacher-student. To go back to the pedagogy of the oppressed, the feeling of like, okay, I'm in a space now, and I am the teacher, or I am the student, or I am the therapist, or I am the leader. All of that is rubbish. When one notices one's I is elastic and actually can be expanded to include all people in the room. So the immediate feeling of enlightenment should be everyone is God. I often say one of the greatest pitfalls in spiritual life is getting anywhere, feeling like you've attained some sort of insight, and then suddenly thinking that everyone else doesn't have it, and that you are somehow like woke or enlightened or something. I think you only see in others what's there in you. So only an unenlightened person will look around and say, look, these are all unenlightened person, I better teach them. That's right. Rather, an enlightened state is really, I would say, one where one recognizes everyone not only as themselves, but since the self is God, one recognizes everyone is literally God. Therefore, when we help someone, it's not out of the attitude that they need help. I'm the helper, they're the helped. No, rather, when we help someone, it's out of the attitude that they are God, needing no help whatsoever, and God, in her compassion, condescends to play the role of a needy person in need of help, to give me the opportunity to sanctify and glorify her, the infinite one, through my humble act of service. Therefore, I am the help because God took the role of the help.
Yeah. That's it. Yeah, that's like how you often end up attracting the people or the situations into your life that like you end up needing in order to teach yourself. So I mean, even in psychology, they talk about, like, psychologists often talk about reenactment or repetitive compulsion, and the idea that you often end up people who have experienced trauma end up reenacting the same trauma as a dynamic with your dad, for example, then becomes the dynamic with your partner, and then you keep reenacting the same thing and the same thing until you are able to recognize that dynamic and break out of it, and then heal that trauma. It's like, there's something within us that is attracted to, or for some reason just like keeps having the dynamics that are there to teach us something, in order for us to be able to heal those aspects of ourselves, I guess. Also I always think to myself about to your point, like the amount, when I'm often criticizing someone else, I'm realizing it's just something that is within myself that I don't like about myself, and I'm realizing that when things don't bother me about other people, that might be legitimate things that bother other people. It's just that those aren't things that I see in myself. So now if I'm ever frustrated about something with someone else, I'm always asking myself, well, probably it's a sign that is something within myself that I need to address. So yeah.
Then we become very grateful for those people who bother us, because what powerful teachings, what insight into our own nature that they offer, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I need to I haven't actually been checking the chat, so if there's any questions.
Yeah, I think we're just kind of having our own conversation here. I also forgot that we're on
there's a lot of people. Let's just see if there are any questions from anyone. Some Iris King asked, how do we process sexual pain whilst recognizing the sacredness of sex? How do we process pedophilia when children are our spiritual teachers? How do we heal those who practice violent sexuality?
Right. Beautiful question. Now, to even get to the question of sacred sexuality requires a lot of integration and actualization. So the point at which one is able, even like we did earlier, we took an inhale and followed the inhale down into the base of the heart. For some people, taking a breath that deep, like flattening the diaphragmatic wall all the way, directing one's attention, that could itself be kind of difficult. You might actually have a reverse emotional reaction to the simple act of being aware of your feet. Or if I say, become aware of the perineum, the point between anus and genitals. If you bring your mind down there, below the belly, you might get actually a reaction. Notice, because it's actually quite, you have to be quite actualized. In other words, quite healed, I would say, integrated, in order to be able to see sacredness in sexuality. If there's a lot of trauma around sexuality, to see the sacredness of it right now, right here, is going to be quite difficult. That trauma has to be addressed first. All of that must be integrated and healed first, and then only can the sacredness reappear in that. So for someone maybe who has had a lot of issues, maybe done onto them, or that they feel like they've done onto others, how do they deal with maybe their past violent sexual transgressions, or their current violent sexual transgressions, or how do they deal with violent sexual transgressions done to them? Like, obviously that's a very deep and meaningful question, and spiritual practice is not something that happens overnight. Shanam Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, it's momentary, it's gradual, and a whole plethora of means needs to be applied. So maybe there's some some therapy, some CBT that happens. Maybe there's some hatha yoga practice with the compassionate teacher to feel into one's body gradually. just building poses gradually. Maybe there's some breath work with a compassionate teacher where gradually one feels into the breath. Maybe there's a lot of meditation where one sits and processes these emotions, not through intellectualizing about them, but just by feeling their energy and allowing that energy to flow. Then, gradually you get to a point where through a lot of spiritual practice, or some, depending on your case, through a lot of contemplation and inquiry, one starts to feel the sacredness in sexuality again. But it doesn't come right away. You can't suddenly, after having experienced a lot of trauma in one area of life, suddenly pretend that there's spirituality or sacredness in it. It's a process.
How do we organize around our sexual pain and increase our awareness together? So I guess it's that organizing. I'm assuming organize is maybe in like social movements and things like that.
I see. So together, not to mean with one's partner or partners, but rather together to mean like as a community, as a collective, as an okay. So can you read that to me again? How do we organize?
How do we organize around our sexual pain and increase our awareness together?
Yeah,
I'm not sure about organizing around our sexual pain. Yeah.
Maybe she means they mean like coming together, like in solidarity and like as a group exploring trauma together.
Okay.
Maybe something like that. That's my take, right?
That makes sense.
Yeah. See, I think one very important and very valuable insight is that everyone everywhere has experienced some degree of sexual trauma, and degree is incredibly subjective. Right? This is important that suffering is subjective. So this is a rather provocative statement, but I've seen more suffering in the Brentwood Starbucks down the street than I've seen in some of the most rural and poverty-stricken parts of India. Honestly, like I remember my experience in places like this in India is that these people have so little, there's so much like material suffering, and yet the level of joy and like social acceptance that each individual experiences is far more than I've noticed in a strange and isolated and alienating Western urban environment. So there, I see people sharing what little they have, kids are playing in the street, and from really talking to these people, I sense a kind of depth and meaning and profundity that inheres in each and every one of their experiences, even though from our standards, they look like they would be suffering. They aren't actually in many cases. This isn't to say that we should not do our best to improve material circumstances in India. Obviously, we should. But this is just to point out that the objective way something looks is not often a testament to its subjective interior experience. So when it comes to sexual trauma, it's important to recognize that everybody to some degree has sexual trauma, and their subjective experience of it could make something that you might consider small be horrifically big. And other people might experience something that you might consider that actually to them means nothing, doesn't really affect them. It's really interesting, this subjectivity of suffering. So in that, I would say it's not just about gathering together in a small group of people who have had a similar bad experience, but rather I would say as a collective, meaning as all beings everywhere, including animals, right? As all beings everywhere, we are all of us dealing with some level of sexual trauma, because the real sexual trauma, as Kathrin pointed out, is probably the schism between body and mind, the inability to feel and be, right? So all of us. So how do we organize and collectivize around like sexual violence, trauma, etc., sexual pain, to recognize that it's not just us or our group, it's everyone. We're all united in solidarity because we are all human beings, and we all are susceptible to this dichotomy of mind-body. So collectivize as an entire community, not just of humans, but of all sentient beings. That's my first point. And secondly, having collectivized now, maybe in smaller groups like what we call sanghas, fellowship, spiritual communities, encourage one another to practice spirituality and discuss sexuality openly, which is exactly what Kathrin has done here. So I think the answer to your question is like Kathrin's very embodiment and being and channel. Right? That to me is the answer to that question.
Thank you very much. Yes, I totally agree. And I think that I love that you said about the degree of sexual pain, because I think that so much of the time, the people that are causing the sexual pain in the first place, they are most of the time coming from so much of their own sexual trauma. Like the people who most people who traumatize other people have themselves experienced trauma. And I think just the even people often assume that like sexual pain is something that just women mostly experience, but I would say that all men experience sexual pain just from their socialization in, as boys and men, into that violent sort of toxic masculinity that teaches you to suppress your emotions. You're only allowed to experience anger, man up, and to be a real man involves you having to embody something that is so disconnected and alienated, and with such little space to have like friendships and community. And it really requires such a profound self-mutilation. And I think that then feeds into the way in which a lot of men have sex in the first place, which is often very disembodied and alienated. And that is such I do think it's sad or limiting if we just see like women as or non-cis men as the people who experience the sexual pain, and that when I think that it's just a sexual pain, a sexual violence in and of itself, just the very gendering and socialization of men in this space in the first place. And so and then that also relates back to our conversation about the projecting outwards, or seeing others as like a mirror to ourselves in a way, because I think that then when we can see that the people that are hurting us are also hurting themselves, then it kind of creates a space of, not that we have to have solidarity with the people who have harmed us, but I think that less of this like punitive mentality, perhaps less of this like prison execution type of mentality towards people who are wrongdoers, and instead a sense of like a transformative justice. How can we heal you? Like what are the root causes that led you to cause this pain in the first place? And how can we heal you through this time? What traumas have you experienced, and what did that teach you? And how did you not have the language to know any better than this? And that kind of thing, I think, can create a totally different type of form of justice than the one that we're used to. And I think that can also be a really profound and beautiful thing. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but yeah.
Oh, what a beautiful insight. Transformative justice as opposed to punitive. The idea that all oppressors are themselves victims, and only in that compassion can there be any real addressing of the problem, is such a deep point. I wish we could talk about that more in more communities, that like one should not feel necessarily angry at oppressors, although it's perfectly natural to feel that, but rather that one should also in that same breath feel sympathetic and feel like they are as much in need of help as any victim is in need of help. Because like we said, all of us are victims in some sense of the basic fundamental schism between mind and body, or between spirit and matter, between transcendence and immanence, if you will. So we all have to figure it out together.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and then often when we have been harmed and we respond by a punishment, often that can just be what can end up leading to punishing yourself, or often by lashing out at others, you're just lashing out at yourself. But also I think that it often betrays a sort of fear in and of yourself. And obviously it's very dependent on the situation. You can't say that for everything, but I've definitely noticed that when I am most likely to want to respond with like anger or violence towards others, I think it's just that there is like a deep shame or fear inside myself for like times I know that I've done something wrong, which we all have. We're like, this isn't a spectrum of like harm doer and victim. There's like, we're all victims sometimes, we're all harm doers other times. Again, going back to the dualism, getting rid of that like hero victim, villain victim dualism. And then it makes me realize that I have a lot of shame inside myself for things that I have done. And then when I'm like lashing out at someone else, I'm realizing that there's a part of me that is so afraid that someone will know, oh, that time that I did that thing that I have all this shame about. So instead of dealing with that shame I'm instead going to like push that shame, but suppress that shame, and instead push this anger and rage towards another person, so that my shame cannot be witnessed, because I'm so afraid of that being witnessed. Whereas if I were to have that level of compassion for my own shame and my own wrongdoings, maybe I could then extend that towards someone else. And I think having a whole society based on punishment, and where there is no space for us to actually be honest about and open about our guilt and shame and fears and things like that, leads to this vicious continual cycle. So I'm just realizing that my laptop is about to turn off. I just need to plug it in. I thought it was already plugged in. A second.
Yes, yes. I suppose one thing I should mention for this audience is those of you who are tuning in to like, for Tantra, and maybe sometimes you might feel like I would do it an injustice to discuss sacred sexuality in the context of Tantra if I didn't mention at least a little bit about the sexual ritual, because there is indeed in Tantra the sexual ritual. It's called the Adi Yaga, or it's a ritual involving two consenting members in a ritual context who are participating in a sexual act, which by the power of the ritual is made sacred. And so the one side, whether male or female, sees themselves or neither, sees themselves as one primordial force, Shiva. And the other side, whether male, female, or neither, or both, sees themselves as Shakti. So there's a duality already in the sexual act. There's Shiva and there's Shakti. But the purpose of the Adi Yaga, which is spelled out in chapter 29 of Abhinavagupta's monumental work, Tantra Loka. In chapter 29, the emphasis is on resolving that duality. So two people come together, one is Shiva, one is Shakti, and they go through a lot of ritual purification to really feel themselves as Shakti or really feel themselves as Shiva. And then when they come together in the sexual act, there's actually no real sexual attraction or lust there. Actually, there's no like sexual charge, funnily enough, at least as Abhinavagupta describes it. If the ritual is done correctly, it will be a purely unitive experience where one no longer feels one's own embodiment as just this body. One transcends that, feels themselves as the other body, but also as all bodies. And then in that moment, supposedly, these two qualified aspirants playing the role of Shiva and Shakti will experience this transcendence of all duality. And it's very powerful. And then interestingly, sacraments are made from that ritual. So like semen or the menses or whatever sacraments arise from that ritual, for better or worse, so this might gross you out, but in the rest of the ritual, those sacraments are actually used ritually. Because if truly non-duality is the case, then God is in everything, even sacraments, like semen and menses, etc. These things become pure, sacred, holy. That one thing I have to say, there is that ritual in chapter 29 of Abhinavagupta's 5,800 verse magnum opus Tantra Loka. There's also another ritual in which a Brahmin or a Kshatriya, which is a high-standing member of society, is invited to enter into a sexual relationship with someone who they would consider a very low caste. So in caste-ridden India, there's this notion where if a certain person looks at my food, I can't eat that food. I can't eat that food anymore. Or if a certain person's shadow falls upon me, I have to go take a bath. I'm not kidding. In ancient caste-ridden India, in medieval India, caste rules were so reified that there were members of your community that you might not even look at or even spit in the direction of. Now imagine, in a ritual setting, your guru tells you, your guru who you have ultimate deference for tells you, okay, you, a Kshatriya or a Brahmin, a high-standing member of society, will now have to enter a sexual relationship with a woman who you wouldn't even dare look at, much less spit in the direction of. Right? Can you imagine what that would do to your psyche? The purpose of that ritual was to overcome all caste distinction. So these have been abused. So these rituals, in their initial context, were about overcoming selfhood or any kind of notion of caste or name or gender even. But now, typically, in its degenerate form, it's used as merely tools for sexual exploitation. It does happen that people call something tantra and invoke these rituals, but then actually use that just as a way to like use other people as means for their own gratification. So there is, I think, even in Tantra, great potential for abuse. We talk about things like these sexual rituals. So just, while you were plugging the computer, and I wanted to make sure that I just, before this conversation ended, said something about that, because it would be remiss of me to mention it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's the idea of the sex with someone you wouldn't even spit in the face of. I think that's interesting because it made me think about how we always, in a way, these ideas of beauty or status or success or other things that we tend to base our relations with other beings on is just limits so much our capacity for joy. Because I think if we were actually to connect with people based on their souls or based on their beings and get rid of not even care about those external things like, oh, I wouldn't spit in the face of this person or the woman you would least likely be able to see any attraction to, and instead if we were to be able to get to a point where we could connect with people based on their beings, as opposed to all these external stuff that doesn't actually matter, we would be so much more liberated in our like joy and relations to people in general, and that I think would be such a beautiful thing. But which again just goes back to this idea that these things that are supposed to give us joy based on capitalist consumerist notions of success, money, status, and no beauty are just so limiting, and often the people that have the most of those things are the least happy of all, because I guess they've had all these things that they're striving towards and think, oh, once I have that then I'll be happy, and then they have it and they realize it was all futile all along. So yeah. I was also wondering with Tantra, is it true, does it have to be slow? Because I think that they are generally, Tantra is always seen as like breathing and being still and present, and I'm often thinking of it as something that's basically just like stillness, but still bodily connection of some sort.
No, beginners should definitely take their time, because often when we slow down, that's when we can feel the spaciousness of awareness. So yes, like taking your time, slowing things down, pausing, yes, it's definitely a big part of it. But once one gets very adept at it, then the pace of life resumes, but you don't lose that space. So I've seen pujaris, ritual practitioners. There's a certain ritual. It's actually a 5-day long ritual. It happens in like August. Durga Puja, it's called. It's one of the most major tantric rituals in the tradition. And there's a part of that ritual that has to be 48 minutes long, just because for astrological reasons it comes between these two time periods at 24 minutes. So the pujari, the ritual officiant, has to get all of this done within 45 minutes. Okay, and it's an incredibly complicated ritual that involves so many things. So if you've ever seen a pujari perform the Durga Puja, it's like this Chamunda period, you'll see the definition of speed, fluidity, and grace, because they're throwing flowers and the flowers are like landing in the perfect places. They're doing all their mudras. They're saying mantras really fast. I feel like it's like a Bruce Lee moment. A camera couldn't capture how quickly this person is moving, right? But it's still wholly embodied, wholly present, wholly spacious. And they've just gone into the place where speed doesn't come at the cost of presence. If you saw Swami Vivekananda, or I imagine the Buddha or Jesus, you would actually see someone who wasn't taking their time. I mean, they had something to do. They had a mission in the world. They had a message to give. So Christ was always up and moving. The Buddha would be, in a town for a few days. He'd give his lectures. He'd be up and moving. I imagine they're kind of brisk walkers to be able to cover so much of, Shankara, Buddha. So much of India was covered in so short time. So these beings to me seem like very dynamic, very driven, very fast-paced individuals, right? So I would say speed doesn't necessarily have to cost presence, but for most beginners, it typically does. So one would say take your time. Also, here Tantra would distinguish, and by Tantra I mean Kaula or left hand, more sensual Tantra. It would distinguish between appetitive consumption and what is called Ramaniya or savoring. So like if I eat chocolate, I have a peak experience, like the joy of the sweetness melting upon my tongue. Now, if I rush from that peak experience to another peak experience, maybe I drink wine, like have the chocolate, sweet, and then I sip the wine, Argentinian frost, delicious Malbec. I don't know. If I'm doing that, all I'm doing is I'm tasting one peak experience and then another. That's called appetitive consumption, right? Which is where I'm looking just for peak experience. However, the tantric consumption, the reason why it needs to be quote unquote slowed down is because when I taste the chocolate, I have to be very alert to the initial arising of sweetness. And I have to watch carefully the point at which a cognition emerges from awareness. That's the way I rest in awareness. Then I have to watch its peak, the way it like swells up into that climactic experience of delicious sweetness. So in the like orgasm of chocolate, I have to be present. Then more importantly, I have to follow, that experience back into awareness as it fades into the depth of my own being. So what it would look like to eat chocolate as a tantrika, it might weird your friends out, but you bite it and you just like sit with it. You might not even chew, actually. You might just sit and meditate on the taste on your tongue melting. And then once long after that taste is gone, you're still there. Because the point of it is to follow the taste into dissolution. And then you're in deep meditation, right? So you're actually taking your time between bites. Or like the sexual act itself, as far as the mechanics are concerned, might be incredibly slow. And I think in this ritual, it was really slowed down. because you would take time and you would even choose certain postures, I think, that would actually lengthen the process, or in some cases even diminish physical pleasure in the process, just so one can enter into maybe the philosophical dimension of what was happening. But even in terms of pleasure, one should take one's time. That's maybe one of the instructions or the invitations of Tantra, if you will.
And I like that idea of, being present for the come down as well, so that you're not just jumping, from one thing to the next. Because I think today, in like modern notions of sexual liberation are often very based on the accumulation of experience, the accumulation of bodies and new sexual contraptions and toys and positions, and there's often this idea like the more, which then reflects capitalist consumerist culture based on more, or like colonial mentality of like grabbing more land, grabbing more people, like, or constantly this like very accumulation mindset. And so I think I think it can be so profound to step away from that and think, okay, just focusing on one experience, even if it's with yourself, and then once you get grounded in that presence within yourself, and then maybe with another being, you no longer have that desire for that accumulation of things to fill the void, because you usually, when you're trying desperately to like have more experiences, more and more and more, it's usually a sign that there is some void within yourself you're trying to fill through these experiences. And I think that is why in some ways we are a sex obsessed culture, because I think we recognize that we do have some sort of disconnect with our bodies. We recognize that we do have some sort of desire for feeling and touch and connection, and then the sex is often the only means by which we are able to have that, because other areas of life we're so disembodied. And so then we become so obsessed with sex as the means through which to achieve those things. But then we're given such a limited sexual experience because sex is so mechanical and disembodied, as we talked about. So then that just heightens our desire for more sex and more sex and more sex, just to like gain that again. And but in the end, it's just like perpetuating the problem. And then you need more to satisfy because you've got used to a certain level. And and it's just becomes a vicious cycle. So I think the more connection with like being actually present with just one experience and like really feeling it into it and the release of it, I think that can be really powerful.
Oh, I haven't thought of it that way. That's really beautiful, that we sense on some level there's a disconnect with the body, and sex seems like the only way to address that. And yet, even when we address it through sex, we bring in the same paradigm that caused that disconnect to begin with. It's not just more toys or more positions or more locations or whatever. It's also more orgasms, right? There are workshops all over the country, at least here in the United States. I noticed a lot of workshops designed to maximize pleasure, but the means through which they're looking is increasing the number of orgasms that one has, both as a male body, female body. Interestingly, the orgasm then is given primacy as like the point of sex, which is an appetitive consumerist way of looking, at it. And Tantra would say the whole of your life before the sex act is foreplay, and the whole of your life after the sex act is postcoital bliss. So either you're living in a perpetual state of postcoital bliss or a perpetual state of foreplay, because the orgasm is never the point,
Yeah, and that is also that very capitalist idea of product over process, where everything is like, oh we care about the product that you're producing at your work, not the process by which it's produced, or the process, are you having joy in the moment, all trying to like get to something tangible, as opposed to and I think again that goes back to like the materialist idea of the world. It's like everything, like you can tangibly see or feel the orgasm, but like everything before that isn't as tangible or can't be named, so it's not seen as valid, I guess.
Right.
And
you mentioned it's not necessarily
no, please continue.
I was gonna say it's not necessarily like that. It must also be seen through the lens of partnered sex also, because there's a text. It's interesting. When we translate these texts, sometimes it's hard to see what exact Sanskrit letter is there, because these texts are kind of old, and although they've been copied over time, there's some corrosion, some decay. So you can't really see. There's a beautiful text which I actually quoted from at the beginning of this conversation, the opening verse of. It's called the Svabodhodaya Manjari, and there's a verse in there about meditating on the satiety of the post-orgasmic state. And the word there is either surata or svarata, which could either mean post-orgasm after like partnered sex, or it could mean post-orgasm svarata, after like self-pleasure, interestingly. But in both cases, one is invited to keep one's mind fixed at a certain point in the body, which is like at the just a point below the navel, right? So one is supposed to keep one's mind fixed on this point, just about 3 fingers below the navel, and fix the mind there after a climax experience. Then one meditates on the feeling of bliss and fullness post-coitus, right? And that's the meditation. And it's invited in both cases of self-pleasure and partnered activity. I think that's kind of interesting too. There's room for just exploring one's own experience, not necessarily even involving anybody else. And that's why I think a lot of tantrikas actually today, although in its classical period between the years like 800 to 1050, it was mostly a householder tradition, which means most of the people participating in this tradition would have been married, would have had children, would have been maybe engaging in the sexual act. Whereas today, most of the great practitioners of Tantra are monks, nuns, they're celibate. Like take Swami Lakshmanju, for instance, or even Abhinavagupta never married. Or I would say the greatest population of Tantrikas now practicing in India in the most classical form of Tantra in the left-hand style would probably be the Tibetan Buddhist. This is a broad sweeping statement. I could be wrong. Obviously, India is incredibly big, but this is just my speculation. Okay, so take this with a grain of salt. I think that the Tibetan Buddhist, the Vajrayana Buddhist form, maybe this is the most collectivized or largest group of practicing Tantrikas, and they're almost exclusively a monastic tradition. Okay, which is very interesting. Although there are many lay devotees, predominantly the monastic tradition. So that would tell you that Tantra, with its incredibly sensualist orientation, actually doesn't even need to involve the sex act or other people participating together in the sex act. Right? That's kind of a profound insight.
Yeah, that is very fascinating. I think that speaks to my experience as well, because I think I think to start off with, it's much easier to begin with myself, as opposed to, I think as soon as you have another person, often there's more inhibitions, or there's I don't know, more self-consciousness or thoughts, or like you're more present with that person's experience and you're not so connected with yourself. So I think it makes sense to me that first to really be able to tap into that Tantra would be to like first try and figure it out by yourself, and then move on to doing that with other people. And it makes sense that it's slow as well, because I can imagine that speeding things up is so much harder to remain present in the moment. And I think that's interesting. I also was wondering if what your thoughts are on does it have to be in a monogamous context, or does it have to be obviously by yourself or in a monogamous context? Or what are the general ideas around like different beings and orgies, or I don't know, open relationships and things like that?
Yeah, it's a great question, because as we know, Indian society is in some cases religiously liberal yet socially conservative. Swami Vivekananda once said, the West is socially liberal yet religiously conservative. He just found that interesting. That in India, you have these really broad-minded philosophical ideas, but on the level of society, often you see some level of like, inhibition, or maybe don't call it that, but a kind of conservative reification of like traditional monogamous married relationships. Right. So this is interesting, because Indian cultural history has like it's an old culture, right? It's like 9,000 years old by some accounts. So it goes through so many different phases of its like response to what a traditional relationship pattern should look like. Because in the Upanishads, we actually do get many cases of non-monogamous relationships. One of them would be the Birhad Aranyak Upanishad, where Yajnavalkya is talking to one of his, I think, 2 or 3 wives. I think he's 2 wives. He's talking to Maitreyi, who herself is a great sage and is also a teacher of Yajnavalkya. So his wife plays the role of teacher, but she's one of several wives, which makes the question of, okay, that makes sense. In ancient societies, often we see a lot of polygamy, where a single male would have, in like more than one wife, which is something that we use. But also, there's a lot of polyandry in the Indian cultural context. One great example is the Mahabharata. In the Mahabharata, this great Indian epic, one of the oldest epics in the world, what ends up happening is Arjuna, and I think this you'll love, there's a very progressive ceremony, albeit it's kind of exclusive to aristocratic communities, where a woman chooses her spouse through designing a contest to find the man whose qualities she values. So if she wanted like an erudite scholar type, she would have a debate, a scholarly debate. Then if she wanted like a great warrior type, she would have a wrestling match, something. Anyway, so this particular woman, the most beautiful princess in the kingdom, it's called a Swayamvara, which is a contest in all the neighboring kingdoms. They send their princes. So at this Swayamvara, the challenge was to shoot an arrow through the eye of a mechanical fish while only looking at its reflection in a murky pond. So I guess she wanted like a husband. So Arjuna, one of the main characters, the central figure, not only of the Gita, but also of this Mahabharata. Arjuna, he shoots, and he does it. He's the only one who's able to do it. So he shoots, he's a great archer. So he wins his bride, right? So Draupadi enters into a married relationship with Arjuna. Now, Arjuna has 4 other brothers, and they're all really happy for him. Arjuna is the 3rd eldest. Now, in India, it's kind of weird for the 3rd or the 2nd eldest to be married before the eldest. That's one that's kind of weird. But because his brothers are so enlightened, they have no problem with this. They're just happy. They're clapping him on the back. And they all decide to go home with this new bride, who they all accept as their sister-in-law. They're all happy. But Arjuna is married to her. Okay, they just did the ceremony and everything. They married. So they're coming home. Now, they're at this time living in exile. So they don't look like princes that they really are. They actually just look like hunting, just dirty forest dwellers, right? So they actually went out on the pretext of hunting for their meal. So their mother, who is there in the shack, she thinks that they've gone out to hunt, okay? So when they come home, they jokingly call out to her, who is inside the shack, "Mom, guess what we caught today?" Right? They're making a joke. They're about to introduce her new daughter-in-law. And from inside the hut, because she didn't see what was good, she goes, "Okay, very good. Make sure you share it amongst all of you." And everyone's like, because mother's word be obeyed. And so they walk in and they're like, "Ma, you said we should share it." This is like awkward moment. And mother says, "My words must have been prophetic. I can't take them back. They've been spoken. You have to follow through. Now all of you are her husband." So good for Draupadi. She now has these like 5 incredibly heroic husbands. So you also get these cases of wonderful like polyandry stories, right? I guess one of the greatest polygamy story in India, one of the most cited and maybe oftentimes misunderstood story is the Rasa Leela of Sri Krishna. So in this great book, the Bhagavatam, which is also an ancient book, 600 BC, maybe 1000 BC, right? In that Bhagavatam, there's an episode where Krishna, one of the most important figures in Hinduism, modern Hinduism, Krishna is a cowherd boy who plays his flute and attracts the erotic desire of all of these cowherd maidens, the gopis. They're maidens. I alluded to this earlier. But all these maidens are like infatuated with Krishna, and they all run towards him. And there are like hundreds of them, if not thousands, right? 108 in some stories. And one of them is actually Lord Shiva. Lord Shiva assumed the form of a female gopika in order to sport with Krishna. And so in this story, what ends up happening is Krishna, according to the Bhagavatam, splits up into like many different Krishnas, and now each gopi gets her own Krishna. Interestingly, it's still kind of monogamy, but it's monogamy within a wider, somewhat bizarre polygamy context, because one Krishna is being divided amongst many different gopis, and all of them are enjoying him in what seems to be a pretty erotic episode. Now, there are differing views on this. Some people go all the way left and say, yeah, it's totally erotic. This is sex and spirituality in its finest, because they're actually making love in a spiritual context, is what we call matura bhava, the attitude of a lover in romantic tryst with God. Now, it's also important that this is a tryst, a love affair. It's not the married conjugal relationships of Rama and Sita. It's a tryst, right? It has to happen in the forest, in secret. And so there's something exciting about it, right? On the other hand, on the right-hand side, they say, no, you don't understand. This is entirely metaphorical. No sex is involved at all. Also, at this point, Krishna must have been like 9. The gopis also must have been like 9. So this Leela, this sport, is more like young children playing with each other. It's not sexual. It shouldn't be sexualized. So in India, this is perhaps one of the most controversial things that is in this culture. It's not rejected there. And the more conservative parts of India will say there's no sex whatsoever. You have to be celibate for 12 years to even take the name Radha. Like that, you have that view. And then you also
Wow,
have the
yeah.
view that says, no, you should feel like Krishna, and your wife should feel like a gopi, or you as a wife should feel like the gopi, and Sri Krishna as your husband is Sri Krishna. Or, and this is somewhat more transgressive, or you should enter into extramarital relationships in order to reproduce the romantic tryst that Krishna had with the gopis. So in India, especially in the
Mm.
18th and 19th and 20th century, you see the rise of like almost exclusively polygamous communities. And why are they polygamous? Partly because of the story in the Bhagavatam. They're trying to recapture that extramarital, like tryst situation, right? So
Yeah,
you
yeah.
find the Bowels, the Goshparas, the a lot of communities. I can name a lot of communities in Bengal that appears in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. He talks about them sometimes. And these communities would be having ceremonies where it can get pretty orgiastic, and you're encouraged actually to have extramarital sex. And in one household, you could have various members all living together in a polygamous community. All of that was happening in ancient India far before our current discussions about it. So yeah, that's in
Hmm.
short all of that.
That's it. Yeah, I was thinking whilst you were talking, how much that could, yeah, the ideas now have shifted, or like how much of the colonial influence there was, because the ideas of monogamy, from my understanding, was really exported across the globe with colonialism and Christianity.
Right.
These ideas. So if yeah, I wonder to what extent that also influenced, not to say that monogamy is always a colonial Christian oppressive
Yeah.
thing, it can obviously be a really beautiful thing, but yeah, I wonder how much that also then influenced the way in which yeah, these spiritual traditions have evolved. And I also was thinking about how, yeah, I can, there are many different ways of thinking about it, I guess, because I think to have just one partner could mean that you could really develop spiritually in your sexual relations, because you're really connected to that
Yes.
person, and there's much more trust and
Right.
Much more depth built up with that person.
Yeah.
And then perhaps if you then have that with many different people, then that can be less of that trust, but then there can be that ecstasy and that excitement that you were talking about, of the, yeah, introducing the other people, and then how that can then help in your relationship to build that up. And so I guess maybe it's like a case by case basis, and maybe
Yeah.
everyone
Yeah.
can see for themselves how it works for them. But it's at the same time, I think at least in the West, there tends to be much more of a focus on many different relations and stuff, and so I think that can often be a limit to that sense
Right.
of, yeah, spiritual connection. So
That's a
yeah, it's
deep insight.
interesting.
I mean, in my case, I have more like a Shiva or Rama vibe. So in my own case, I really
Yeah.
resonate with what you said about the spiritual value of monogamy. So I'm like, in
Mm-hmm.
my own spiritual practice, very committed to monogamy. So in the sense that I would see myself as a Bhairava, and my wife is Bhairavi, and my wife is my one
Mm-hmm.
exclusive Bhairavi. So you'll notice
Mm-hmm.
Rama, Sita are like so monogamous. Rama, he won't think of anybody but Sita. And so much
Yeah.
so that even when Sita had to leave the kingdom, he refused to remarry, although it would have been important for him to do so for like state official events. He just refused because he only
Mm-hmm.
had a one-track mind for Sita. You know, Sita also,
Yeah.
although she was in the palace of King Ravana, who took all these different forms, would never dream of having any other partner except for Rama. So Rama and Sita eternally conjoined. But even better an example is Shiva and Shakti. So Shiva and Parvati, they're obsessed with only each other. Why? Because they're both infinite. So in Parvati, Shiva sees all women. In her, he experiences the totality of the
Mm.
universe. And then in Shiva, Parvati sees the totality of all transcendence and so the
Yeah.
dance between transcendence immanence will always be between two poles. So I definitely, in my tradition and in
Mm.
my practice, have more of a Shiva and Rama vibe. Where I'm married, I
Mm-hmm.
see my wife as the be all end all. Like she's my Parvati, she's my Sita, like that, you know.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
therefore I regard every other woman other than my wife, being of course heterosexual as I am, I would regard every other woman, and if I was bisexual, every other man as mother herself. So every other woman is like
Mm-hmm.
mother to me or sister to me. So my relationship to every
Mm-hmm.
woman in my life is a sisterly one, or in some cases a childlike one. Older women tend to like mother me. That's kind of, I don't know, I'm a childlike. But with my wife, like she's exclusively my partner, you know. So that's my take. But
Mm-hmm.
importantly, while that works for some people, you're right. Like in other cases, and it's always case by case, maybe a more like free, loose. Maybe that will help them feel into their own being, and through experiencing
Mm-hmm.
others, they come to reflect in those people themselves. And it can be very different for different people, but certainly both work, each to their own, I
Yeah.
suppose.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that about your insights in general, that there isn't that like dogmatism or that like universalizing tendency that, again, we often see in that Christian colonial Western type of philosophy, where it's like the arrogance of believing that our way is the correct way and that everyone should follow that exact like model of how things, ways of doing. And I think, yeah, it's very liberating to say that for different people, different things might work, and to like, yeah, be self-critical about why, because it can be that you may believe that, oh, this I don't know, I want to have lots of orgies and that's spiritually enlightening, when maybe there's some deeper ego or something involved there. So to be definitely like self-critical or self-reflective, but still, to notice that for different people, different things might work. Yeah, I'm really mindful of your time, but I wanted to ask you one other thing, but I don't know if you need to go, or how much time you have left
Ask.
to discuss. Pardon?
Ask away.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, just talk about sacred sex in relationship to nature, because I was reading this article called "Taking Love Seriously in Human-Plant Relations in Mozambique" towards an anthropology of affective encounters by Julie Archambault. And it basically talks about this idea that some people view plants as their lovers, and they sort of, this idea that how can our like ideas of sacred sexuality also extend towards nature and animals, and to what extent there is like a relationship of eroticism or sexuality in how we view plants. Because when I initially hear thinking about plants as your lovers, or thinking of like sexual relations with a plant or something like that, I don't fully connect with that as much. But at the same time, I do really think that we are all interconnected, and we are so separated from nature, and we do really need to connect more to nature and really feel that sanctity. And I think someone on the Discord said something about how, the chirps of cricket at night and the cool dirt between your toes and the tingles and things like that, there is something erotic about that. Or I find that, if I put my hands on the earth, there is something really sensual in those encounters. So I guess I just wondered about the relationship between sacred sex and nature, or if this just goes back to what we were talking about with just awareness and eroticism in all things, including nature, and so nature is just an aspect of that, or if there is something unique about nature that it goes beyond what we already discussed.
It's both. You're right, absolutely right, that it does go back to our discussion earlier about sensing into awareness, and then that being itself the erotic experience. But nature is unique, because nature has a unique way of connecting us to awareness. Because there's something about nature that defies storytelling. Nature has a kind of immediacy and a bewildering structure, harmony, and beauty to it, and the mind just becomes totally silent in the face of true nature. It just becomes very humbled, because it knows it, in its finitude, cannot understand the depth of structure and harmony and beauty and creative genesis that's inherent here in nature. The mind knows that it's out of its depth. And so we find that when quietly walking in the forest, or looking into a still lake, or sitting in a cave, hearing the wind and the leaves, we find that in these moments, they're especially sacred moments, because, interestingly, they're especially quiet moments. The mind just backed away, and it gives you the space. And in that space, there can come this rush of embodied sensual realization. So then when you feel pure awareness, at the same time feeling the dirt in between the toes, together you have this experience of transcendence making out with immanence. And that's the ultimate. So you see, in spiritual life, there are different types of spiritual experiences, or I wouldn't say experiences, but realizations. Some are more transcendent in nature, where you just enter into pure awareness and you get absorbed wholly in the transcendent at the exclusion of the immanent. So nature vanishes, body vanishes, what to say of the objects of my eyes and ears. All of the world vanishes, because I no longer know where I put my body. Mind is gone. And because the world only exists really as a representation in my mind, when it's gone, what's left is just pure transcendental bliss, but it's of a quality that's very clear, very cool, very peaceful, very, you know, lofty,
Mm.
right? However,
Yeah.
certain people have a different flavor where they experience that while wholly present in some embodied experience, like the dirt or like the crickets or like the touch of water
Mm.
or the tree bark. And if you have that experience, that's what might lead you to say, oh my God, this is so sexually meaningful. Because my hand is on the
Mm.
cool bark, I can feel the moss, and yet there's an orgiastic quality to something like, what? I must be in love with this tree. You know, you notice how you could, in some cases,
Yeah.
misattribute. You could say, oh, I'm entering into a sexual relationship with this tree. Why? Because I experienced a sexual ecstasy with this tree. But a person who makes that statement is perhaps missing the point. The reason why they entered into sexual ecstasy with that tree is because they were able in that moment to just be present with the totality of their experience, sans any storytelling.
Mhm.
To the degree that they're able to do that, they'll start to feel it with all trees, with the whole forest. They'll feel it also with all of the urban settings, all the buildings, all the cars. A car going by will be like a caress on the back of my neck. You know, so this is
Mm.
actually the super sexual ecstasy. I actually heard a great tantric master call it this super sexual ecstasy. This is a super sexual ecstasy of actually being embodied as all of this. And since most of this is nature, right?
Mhm.
Therefore, obviously, I'm right now in this moment, right now, I'm in a heated romance, not only with nature, but with all of manifest existence. For I am none
Yeah.
other than that Shiva, that awareness, who is always married and who is always making love with his Shakti, who is none other than one and the same with him. You know?
Yeah. Yeah, that is beautiful. Thank you so much. This has been yeah, just such a wonderful, beautiful conversation. And I was having a bad day today, and I think you've just really made me so much happier. So I'm really grateful to you for this experience. I feel like I've
Likewise,
learned so
likewise.
much from what you have said. Is there anything else that you would like to, yeah, you feel in this moment that you're like, oh, I really want to talk about that, I really want to mention that, or anything that is coming up for you?
You know, talking to you, Kathrin, I get the sense that nothing is left unsaid. Like you've managed to somehow explore some of the deepest and most important issues to me, like the harmony of all religions, the total equality, and not even equality, but reverence of seeing everyone as God, or the tremendous potential in every experience to be deeply sexually satisfying without even the sex act. Like all of these things I
Mhm.
thought would be central to discussions about sacred sexuality, and somehow you intuitively understood that, you know, these would be the main issues. So I feel so satiated. Like I've said everything I need to say, or everything needs to be said, I think has been said through us. So I'm really grateful, Kathrin.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. It's been
You
such
know,
a
this I didn't say. It just occurred. I was like, yes. I did want to say thank you so much for, you know, collectivizing in this way. Like this channel, I had a chance to like click through it and look at it. It's so important, this work. You know, that you've created this space in which people can feel comfortable to have what I think are really nuanced, like incredibly rich and sophisticated discussions about sexuality that go far beyond, you know, what most people would consider sexuality, to include not just spirituality, but also all other levels of, you know, sociology, cultural experience, political ideology. So cool what you're doing. And this act itself would be the most tantric thing a person could do, to see that in all things, in all different means and fields of life, there's central issues. And you can address any
Mhm.
one issue through addressing it anywhere else. Because truly, only one exists, and all of this is an expression of that same one. So your very being, your embodiment, your channel, I think is a testament to some of these ideas, that all of these ideas that we discussed today. So I wanted to say, above all, thank you for being you, for manifesting Divine Mother through this form, and for making this channel and having me on and having everyone on. And thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much, and I could say the same for all the work that you do. I have linked yeah, your music, I have linked your channel, I've linked your books. I'm looking forward to checking more of those out myself, because I haven't looked at your books or your music yet. I've just looked at your YouTube channel. But yes, I think it's such a wonderful thing that you're giving. And actually, I was really inspired by some of your videos, because I think that what I found on my channel, that I often feel like I'm so trying to force the information in a way, or like doing a lot of research, and then because I want to make sure that everything is said perfectly or whatever. And I feel more and more inspired to just sort of be present in the moment, or like turn on the camera or whatever, and just allow whatever comes out in that moment to sort of flow through. Because one of my friends, she said she's a therapist for children, and she says before each of her therapy sessions she just does a 5-minute meditation. She's very spiritual, and she just says that in that moment she allows the being or God or whatever to be of service through her presence. And I was really inspired by that. And I think people talk about that in ancient Greece in terms of creativity as well, this idea that we are not our the creation doesn't come from us. I think we talked about this beforehand as well, that creativity is something like a gift that we have been given that to manifest through us, but isn't really us. And nowadays we see creativity as something that is me and my creation, things like that. But anyway, I guess I was thinking about this or inspired by you through this, that I instead of trying to master this idea of wanting to this perfectionist idea with the scripting of the writing of the video, I think often the soul of the spirit of what you're trying to say and doesn't often shine through when you're trying to force it in that way. So now I just want to be okay, what do I want to say right now? What is coming through me right now in this moment? And then it enables it to, I think people then sense more of the heart and spirit of what you're saying as well, as opposed to if that makes sense.
Totally it does. And you are a being in love, so love expresses itself through its own means, and you just have to show up for it, right? So I really resonate with what you're saying, and I pray to the Divine Mother that we may always be a perfect expression of the totality of this moment without any reservation whatsoever. I pray that we may never be attached to the outcomes of our practice, that we may never be attached to how we think it ought to be or how it ought to sound or what should happen. I pray that we can drop all of these limiting notions and just relax or repose into the spacious, transcendent, immanent reality that is in each and every moment unfolding. Om.
It's such a beautiful thing to end with a prayer and start with a prayer. It definitely changes the relationship, I think, to what is creative. So I love that. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. And thank you so much, Nish, for being here. And I will end the broadcast now.
Om.